England's royals built empires, commanded armies, and staged pageantry to awe the world, yet their strangest stories sound less like history and more like dark satire. A king undone by lampreys, a queen who carried a phantom child, a prince's dog accused of sorcery. Tonight, we open the vault on the monarchy's most bizarre, unnerving, and unforgettable tales, true stories that prove the crown is never as polished as it looks. Settle in. This is history stripped of ceremony, where dignity meets absurdity and the past refuses to behave. Before we dive headlong into centuries of royal chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next descent into history's strangest corners. And while you're here, tell me where in the world are you listening from, and what hour of the night or morning has dragged you into these bizarre tales. William the Conqueror's exploding funeral. William the Conqueror's story was supposed to end with triumph. The man who had crossed the Channel in 1066, beaten the last Anglo-Saxon king at Hastings, and turned England into his personal prize, deserved a closing act filled with pomp, incense, and marble dignity. Instead, the grand finale of his life played out as one of the most infamous slapstick tragedies in royal history. The funeral where the corpse of the great conqueror simply refused to cooperate. William's death itself was no warrior's blaze of glory. In 1087, while campaigning in northern France, his horse stumbled as he rode through the burning ruins of Mantes. The saddle thrust against his abdomen with crushing force. The wound festered, his body swelling painfully, until he expired weeks later. For a man who had fought with steel and fire, death came through something as banal as falling the wrong way off a horse. And yet that was only the beginning of the humiliation. By the time his body was transported to Caen for burial at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, decomposition had already set in. This was not unusual in the 11th century. Embalming techniques were primitive, transport was slow, and September heat was merciless. The conqueror of England arrived at his own funeral already in a precarious state. Then came the coffin problem. The monks had a sarcophagus prepared narrow, precise, meant to fit a king with solemn dignity. But William had not died as the slim warrior of Hastings. Years of feasting, aging, and now swelling from his mortal injury had made him too large. When the pallbearers tried to lower him into the coffin, they discovered the fit was impossible. The solution? They forced him. Chroniclers record with grim relish what happened next. As attendants pressed the bloated corpse into the stone container, the abdominal cavity burst. The air filled with a stench so revolting that the mourners, nobles, bishops, abbots were forced to flee, gagging. From the church, what was supposed to be a moment of eternal majesty collapsed into chaos. There is a cruel poetry in this ending. William, who had spent his life squeezing others' villages, barons, entire nations into submission, was himself squeezed one final time. And just as his reign was marked by violence and upheaval, so too was his burial. Noisy, messy, unforgettable. Contemporaries were quick to moralize. To them, this was no accident of biology but an act of divine justice. William had been ruthless, harrying the north of England into famine, seizing lands, crushing resistance. The explosion at his funeral was a heavenly verdict, a foul-smelling epitaph carved not in stone but in stench. The lesson was clear. Even the greatest conqueror cannot conquer decay. Modern historians, ever cautious, note that the story may have been embellished. Chroniclers love to humiliate kings posthumously, turning physical failure into allegory. Yet, the details severe abdominal injury, obesity, decomposition during transport make the incident disturbingly plausible. One need not stretch the imagination far to see the tale as both factual and metaphorical. A body literally bursting under the weight of its own contradictions. And so William's end lingers in memory, not for his triumph at Hastings or his castles across England, but for a funeral gone spectacularly wrong. It is the kind of story that sticks because it is both grotesque and symbolic, a reminder that kings are still flesh, and flesh refuses to obey ceremony. If William's body collapsed under pressure, his descendant King John would face the opposite fate. Not too much, but too little. For John, the great humiliation was not what burst out of him, but what slipped away from him forever. The glittering crown jewels of England, vanishing into the mud and tide of the wash. King John's crown jewels vanish in the wash. 1216. If William the Conqueror's funeral was the ultimate punchline about the limits of royal dignity, King John's great disaster was a lesson in how easily the trappings of kingship could simply vanish. And vanish they did, swallowed by the sea in a spectacle that felt like a parody written by history itself. John had already earned himself the title of England's Bad King. His reputation was so bad, in fact, that popular culture forever cast him as the villain in Robin Hood stories, a conniving monarch wringing every last coin from his subjects while losing battles on the continent. But history, unkind as ever, gave him one more humiliation on his way out of life, a vanishing act involving wagons of treasure, an incoming tide, and an estuary known ominously as the Wash. The year was 1216, and England was in chaos. John was embroiled in civil war against rebel barons who had grown so fed up with his incompetence and cruelty that they invited Prince Louis of France to invade. Yes, things were going so badly that the English nobility literally preferred to be ruled by a Frenchman rather than John. While armies marched and castles fell, John scurried across the realm with his entourage, dragging his baggage train and, more importantly, his crown jewels and treasure. Why carry them into danger? Because kingship in the Middle Ages wasn't just about political control. It was also about symbols, the crown, the scepter, the relics, the gold. Without them, your power felt incomplete. These were not trinkets to be left behind. They were the physical embodiment of monarchy, and John, paranoid as ever, wanted them close. The Wash was the next obstacle. This tidal estuary in eastern England is a deceptively beautiful place, wide skies, shifting sands, glimmering waters. But underneath, it's treacherous. Its tides are fast, its mud deceptively soft. It is the kind of place where timing is everything. Cross at the wrong moment, and what looks like solid ground becomes a trap. Medieval travellers knew this. John, apparently, did not. As John and his men attempted to cross, disaster struck. Wagons laden with treasure became mired in the mud. Horses panicked, carts overturned, tides rushed in. The glittering symbols of the crown, the regalia, the jewels, the wealth that kings hoarded to prove their divine right, were pulled under by nature itself. Chroniclers tell us that the wagons sank, swallowed whole, the treasures disappearing into the watery depths of the Wash. Did John watch it happen? Accounts differ. Some place him at a safer crossing, others at the scene itself. Either way, the humiliation stuck. The king had lost his jewels to the mud and sea. No amount of royal authority could command them back. They were gone. The symbolism was too perfect for contemporaries to resist. Here was a king already reviled for tyranny, now stripped of the very emblems of kingship. Chroniclers gleefully framed it as divine punishment, as if God himself had reached down and plucked the crown from John's head. To them it was a morality play. Greed, arrogance, and incompetence punished by nature's indifferent hand. And the loss was not just symbolic. Treasure in the Middle Ages was power. It paid soldiers, secured loyalty, and underwrote every campaign. Losing it in the middle of a civil war was catastrophic. John's already failing position worsened. Within days of the Wash disaster, he fell ill, some say from dysentery, others from sheer exhaustion and despair, and died at Newark Castle. He was only 49, and his reign ended as it had lived, in failure. The crown jewels, however, never reappeared. For over 800 years, the story has tantalized treasure hunters. What lies beneath the mud of the Wash? Could fragments of medieval regalia still be buried there, preserved in silt? Expeditions have scoured the estuary, dredging and probing, but nothing has surfaced. The Wash, secretive and shifting, has refused to yield its secret. The mystery endures because it feels like unfinished business. Crowns and scepters aren't supposed to vanish, they're supposed to last, to anchor a monarchy in permanence. John's jewels remind us that permanence is an illusion. Even the crown itself, the most potent symbol of monarchy, can sink without trace, leaving behind only rumours and frustration. There's also a perverse satisfaction in the tale. John's reign was marked by his insatiable appetite for wealth and his endless demands on his subjects. To see him undone by treasure itself, to have his jewels pulled from his grasp by mud and tide, feels almost like poetic justice. History has a dry sense of humour, and in John's case, it laughed all the way to the estuary. And so John is remembered less for what he built than for what he lost. Magna Carta forced upon him, Normandy slipping from his grasp, and finally his jewels disappearing forever beneath the water. The irony is that his son, Henry III, would reign for decades, but John's legacy remains that of the king who lost everything. But if John's downfall was about vanishing treasures, the story of his descendant Edward II is about something far murkier, not jewels, but the disappearance of truth itself. For Edward, the question was not what was lost in a tidal estuary, but what exactly happened inside a locked chamber in Berkeley Castle, a mystery that still sparks debate, scandal, and suspicion 700 years later. William's coffin may have exploded into legend, and John's crown jewels may still be rusting beneath the Wash. But before we follow the trail of vanished kings and unlucky heirs, a quick word. If you're enjoying this dive into royal absurdities, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the next descent into mystery. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time on the clock finds you wandering through these stories with me? Edward II's infamous red-hot poker murder. If William the Conqueror ended as a grotesque accident of biology, and King John ended as the butt of a cosmic joke played by mud and tide, then Edward II's fate is remembered as a cautionary tale wrapped in rumour. Few English monarchs have been so thoroughly undone by the stories that followed their death. His reign was already infamous for mismanagement, and his end became synonymous with scandal, whispered in tones of both horror and mockery. The infamous red-hot poker story may be one of history's most lurid legends, but its endurance says more about how we love to memorialize weakness than about what actually happened in that locked chamber at Berkeley Castle. Edward was the son of Edward I. Longshanks, a man carved from granite who towered both literally and metaphorically over his era. Edward II inherited none of his father's steel. Instead of a warrior king, England found itself saddled with a monarch who adored pageantry, music, and the company of favourites who were widely despised by the nobility. He lavished gifts and titles upon men like Piers Gaveston and, later, Hugh Despenser, while alienating the very barons whose support he needed. Where his father subdued Scotland with grim determination, Edward II contrived to lose humiliatingly at Bannockburn in 1314, a defeat that resounded for generations. By the 1322nd, resentment boiled over. The barons rebelled, and his queen, Isabella of France, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, turned against him. She allied herself with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and launched an invasion in 1326. Edward's regime crumbled with astonishing speed. His hated favourite, Despenser, was executed, and Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. For a king already branded as weak, this was the final humiliation, to lose not just his crown, but his authority as father and monarch. And so Edward was placed in confinement at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Here begins the mystery. By September 1327, word reached London that the former king was dead. The official story was vague. He had died in captivity, likely of natural causes, his health weakened by stress and neglect. Yet within months, rumours began to circulate that something darker had occurred, something staged to ensure no rallying point could ever emerge around the deposed monarch. The most famous version, recorded years later by chroniclers, claimed Edward was murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker. The details were specific enough to be memorable, but vague enough to avoid physical proof. The story carried a cruel symbolism. It implied not just murder but humiliation, mocking Edward's alleged weaknesses and effeminacy. It was scandal weaponized into historical memory. But historians are quick to note that the story appeared suspiciously late. The earliest accounts of Edward's death do not mention such a method. It was only in later decades, when chroniclers were eager to moralize or entertain, that the lurid tale took hold. Why did it stick? Because it fit the image of Edward that his enemies wanted to project, a weak, ineffectual king undone in a manner that was both theatrical and degrading. The truth, whether he died of neglect, suffocation, or some other method, was less interesting than the legend. There is also the intriguing possibility that Edward II did not die at Berkeley at all. Some records hint at sightings of the deposed king years after 1327, wandering in Europe, cloaked in obscurity. Letters from the period mention a mysterious hermit king whose identity seemed too convenient to ignore. Could Isabella and Mortimer have staged his death to secure their power, only to keep him alive in exile? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive, yet it shows just how uncertain the official narrative was. In the end, Edward's legacy was written not by his deeds, but by his enemies' stories. The red-hot poker legend became shorthand for everything about his reign: weakness, scandal, humiliation. It is worth remembering that Edward had qualities that don't survive in the rumour mill. He was deeply religious, devoted to building projects, and interested in commoners' pastimes. But history does not reward kings for being relatable. It punishes them for failing to rule with strength. And so, Edward II lives on as a kind of historical caricature. The king who died in lurid disgrace, his name forever tethered to a story too grotesque to be dismissed and too satisfying to be ignored. His actual fate may remain unknowable, but the legend is what sticks, because legends do not care about truth, they care about narrative, about reinforcing the image of monarchy as both powerful and absurdly vulnerable. And if Edward II's death blurred the line between truth and scandal, his brother's fate would make the boundary between dignity and absurdity collapse entirely. For George, Duke of Clarence, did not die by sword, fire, or rumour, but if the records are to be believed, by drowning in a barrel of wine, raising the question of whether royalty, in the end, is just one long toast to human folly. George, Duke of Clarence, executed by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine, 1478. If Edward II's story left behind more rumour than certainty, the tale of George, Duke of Clarence, takes us into territory where absurdity, symbolism, and possibly even truth collide. Few deaths in the history of the English nobility have carried the same blend of macabre humour and political intrigue. For a while, the method of Clarence's execution might sound like the invention of a satirist, a duke drowned in a vat of sweet dessert wine. It is a tale that has haunted English history for centuries. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, was the brother of two kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Born in 1449 into the turbulent world of the Wars of the Roses, George's life was defined by shifting loyalties and ambition. The wars were not just a dynastic conflict between Yorkists and Lancastrians, they were a prolonged blood feud in which betrayal was almost a currency of survival. George excelled at betrayal. He supported his brother Edward IV, then defected to the Lancastrians, then returned again to Edward's side. He was, in short, a man of shifting tides, always looking for an angle, always calculating how to turn political winds in his favour. Yet his ambition constantly collided with the reality that he was not the king. He was the king's brother, important but expendable, powerful but not supreme. That position bred resentment and suspicion. Edward IV, though capable of generosity, could not tolerate treachery indefinitely. George's plots and accusations grew more reckless. In 1477, after the death of his wife, Isabel Neville herself, a powerful heiress, George accused members of her household of poisoning her. He had one of her servants executed without trial, a dangerous act of arrogance in a kingdom where only the king's justice was supposed to hold sway. Edward had had enough. George was arrested, tried for treason, and convicted. Parliament itself passed the Act of Attainder against him, an official erasure of his status and rights. To condemn one's own brother in this way was brutal, but it reflected both Edward's desperation to maintain control and the poisonous politics of the age. Then came the peculiar detail that has immortalized George's death, the claim that he was executed privately in the Tower of London by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A butt was not a small barrel, it was a massive cask, holding around 477 litres. Malmsey itself was a rich, sweet wine imported from the Mediterranean, fashionable among the English nobility. If the story is true, then Clarence's end was as indulgent as it was grotesque. Death by luxury, a fate both absurd and symbolic. But was it true? Chroniclers of the time reported with some confidence. Even Shakespeare, writing over a century later, incorporated the tale into Richard III, where Clarence dreams of drowning before meeting his supposed fate. Yet historians debate whether the story was literal or metaphorical. Perhaps the butt of Malmsey was simply a phrase for his burial choice. He may have wished to be buried in a wine cask, or perhaps his body was transported that way. Others argue that Edward allowed Clarence the choice of his manner of death, and that George, with a taste for irony or simply an affinity for wine, chose this bizarre method. Whether fact or embellishment, the story endured because it was so fitting. Clarence, the man of shifting loyalties, died submerged in liquid. Clarence, the ambitious schemer, met his end in indulgence. It was as if his whole life, greedy, unstable, extravagant, was distilled into one unforgettable image. There is also the moral edge to the tale. Medieval chroniclers loved to see divine justice in unusual deaths. Just as William the Conqueror's exploding funeral was cast as punishment for his brutality, Clarence's wine barrel demise could be read as God's commentary on his excess and treachery. Luxury and ambition drowned him, literally, not just metaphorically. And then there is the absurdity. If monarchy thrives on spectacle, then Clarence's death supplied it in spades. Imagine the whispers among courtiers, the jokes passed in taverns, the scandalized amusement of foreign ambassadors. A duke drowned in wine. It sounds more like a parable than a record of state punishment. No sword, no axe, No gallows, just the image of a man disappearing into a cask, his body and memory soaked in syrupy sweetness. Shakespeare, of course, could not resist the drama. In his version, Clarence is haunted by dreams of drowning before being dispatched by assassins who submerge him in the fatal butt. The bard amplified the pathos, but the story needed little embellishment. It already had everything: treachery, family betrayal, political intrigue, and a death so bizarre it demanded to be remembered. In the end, Clarence's fate illustrates a broader truth about monarchy: that death is never just death. It becomes symbol, allegory, spectacle. Kings and princes do not get to die quietly. Their ends are scrutinized, moralized, and often twisted into entertainment. Clarence may have been remembered as a traitor, but his manner of death guaranteed him a place in the pantheon of bizarre royal stories. And yet, even Clarence's wine barrel execution pales in comparison to what came next in royal lore. For in the early 18th century, England would witness a spectacle so outrageous that it fooled not only the common people, but also the king's own physicians, a strange affair involving a woman, a series of rabbit births, and the royal court caught in one of history's most bizarre medical hoaxes, Mary Toft's rabbit births hoax, 1726. If George, Duke of Clarence, drowned in his cask of Malmsey wine provided a story too absurd to forget, then Mary Toft's infamous hoax nearly 2.5 centuries later proved that absurdity was not limited to royal deaths. Sometimes, the monarchy's strangest moments came not from the royals themselves, but from those who sought to deceive or dazzle them. The tale of Mary Toft and her alleged rabbit births is so astonishing that it seems almost impossible anyone believed it. But for a brief, surreal period in 1726, court physicians and surgeons were completely taken in. Mary Toft was a 4-year-old woman living in Godalming, Surrey. Life was hard. She was poor, uneducated, and working class, struggling to survive in an era when infant mortality and poverty were constant companions. And yet she became, for a few remarkable weeks, the centre of England's attention. Her claim? That she was giving birth not to children, but to rabbits. It began with a miscarriage in the summer of 1726. After this, Mary claimed she began delivering animal parts, fragments of organs and tissue that left local physicians baffled. Soon, entire rabbits were said to be emerging, delivered piece by piece or whole. Astonishingly, this claim was not laughed out of town. Instead, it captured the imagination of the medical men who examined her. The key figure was John Howard, a local surgeon who attended Toft during her supposed deliveries. He reported what he saw with such seriousness that the story spread rapidly. Soon, prominent doctors, including members of King George I's medical staff, were summoned to witness the marvel. Among them was Nathaniel Street Andre, the king's Swiss-born surgeon-anatomist. Street Andre examined Toft, and, to the amazement of posterity, declared the births genuine. He wrote excitedly to court, describing her case as one of the most extraordinary phenomena which has ever appeared in nature. The absurdity of the situation is almost impossible to overstate. Learned men of science, trained physicians entrusted with the health of kings were publicly insisting that a woman was giving birth to rabbits. Newspapers printed sensational accounts. Crowds gathered. Toft became a national spectacle, her modest home overrun with observers, her name whispered in taverns, coffee houses, and the halls of Westminster alike. How did she do it? The answer, of course, was simple deception. Toft had conspired to insert rabbit parts into her body and then deliver them, convincing witnesses that something miraculous was happening. The plan was crude, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable, but it played upon the eagerness of doctors to discover marvels. Early 18th century medicine, though more advanced than the medieval world, was still full of mystery and speculation. Nature was thought capable of producing anomalies, monstrous births that reflected maternal imagination or divine intervention. If Toft had handled a rabbit during pregnancy, some thought perhaps her child might resemble one. In such a world, her claim did not seem entirely beyond belief. The hoax unravelled when Toft was taken to London for closer scrutiny. There, under near constant watch, she could no longer produce rabbits. Suspicion grew. When pressed, she confessed the scheme, implicating accomplices who had supplied her with the animals. The scandal exploded. Physicians like Street Andre were ridiculed, their reputations destroyed. Pamphleteers mocked the gullibility of learned men who, in their eagerness for discovery, had abandoned common sense. What makes the Toft affair particularly striking is how it reflects on power. The monarchy, by extension, was embarrassed. After all, the king's physicians had lent their authority to the nonsense. The episode became a parable about the dangers of credulity and the eagerness to believe in wonders. For Mary Toft herself, the story ended not with execution or permanent disgrace, but with a brief imprisonment and eventual obscurity. Yet for history, her name remains indelibly linked to one of the strangest episodes in royal medical history, the woman who made a fool of the king's doctors with a basket of rabbits. If Clarence's wine cask was about indulgence and Toft's rabbits were about deception, then the next tale is about emptiness, the phantom swelling of a queen who believed she was carrying England's future, only to deliver nothing at all. Mary the Fant's phantom pregnancy. In the annals of royal misfortune, few stories are as haunting as that of Queen Mary I's phantom pregnancy. Known later as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, Mary's reign is often remembered for religious strife and bloodshed. But behind the political turmoil was a deeply personal tragedy, one that not only shaped her legacy, but also raised questions about how much a monarch's body could dictate the fate of a nation. Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne in 1553 determined to restore England to the Catholic faith. But just as important as religion was the question of succession. Mary was in her late 30s, an advanced age for childbearing in the 16th century, and desperate to produce an heir who would secure Catholic rule. Without one, the Protestant cause, embodied by her half-sister Elizabeth, would triumph after her death. In 1554, Mary announced she was pregnant. She displayed the outward signs: swelling belly, cessation of her cycles, cravings, and the unmistakable confidence of a woman awaiting motherhood. Court physicians confirmed it. Bells rang across England, bonfires were lit, and prayers of thanksgiving were said. The prospect of a Catholic heir thrilled her supporters and terrified her enemies. Months passed. The court prepared nurseries and ordered gowns for the expected infant. Foreign ambassadors reported breathlessly on the Queen's condition. Yet as time dragged on, no child appeared. The expected delivery date came and went. Still no labour. Courtiers grew restless, then uneasy. Whispers spread. Was the Queen deceiving them? Was this a false pregnancy? The truth was both more tragic and more mysterious. Mary had suffered what modern medicine recognizes as pseudokesis, or phantom pregnancy, a condition in which the body manifests all the symptoms of pregnancy without the presence of a child. It was not an act of deceit but of misplaced hope, amplified by stress, desperation, and the weight of dynastic expectation. Mary wanted so badly to be a mother, to save her faith and her throne, that her body seemed to conspire with her imagination. By the summer of 1555, it was undeniable. There would be no royal child. The celebration turned to embarrassment, then despair. Enemies of the crown seized on the humiliation. Mary was mocked, her legitimacy undermined by her failure not only to rule effectively, but to do what queens were expected to do bear heirs. Even more cruelly, a similar episode repeated itself in 1557 when Mary again believed herself pregnant. Once more, no child arrived. Instead, she fell into declining health, and in 1558 she died, leaving the throne to Elizabeth I, and with it the Protestant settlement she had feared. The phantom pregnancies reveal not just personal sorrow, but the brutal political reality of the time. A queen's worth was measured not in victories or reforms, but in the ability to produce heirs. Mary's body became the battlefield of politics, her phantom swelling a symbol of Catholicism's doomed future in England. Historians have debated the cause of her condition: hormonal imbalance, psychological stress, or underlying illness. But the effect was the same. The hopes of a kingdom, briefly raised to fever pitch, collapsed into nothing. It was the cruelest of deceptions, made not by courtly intrigue or deliberate lies, but by the body itself. And as if one phantom heir were not enough, the monarchy would soon face another pregnancy scandal, this time not a false one, but a disputed one. For in 1688, a baby was born into the royal bedchamber under circumstances so suspicious that enemies claimed he had been smuggled inside a warming pan, a supposed fraud that set the kingdom ablaze. The warming pan baby, 1688. If Mary I's phantom pregnancy showed how devastating it could be when a much-anticipated child never appeared, the case of James II's son showed the opposite danger. What happens when a child did appear, but almost nobody believed it was real? The year was 1688, a year that would change the monarchy forever, and the so-called warming pan baby became both a scandal and a weapon that helped topple a king. James II of England, younger brother of Charles II, had ascended to the throne in 1685. He was Catholic in a country increasingly defined by Protestant identity, and his reign was marked from the beginning by suspicion and tension. His open Catholicism alienated much of the political nation, and while many tolerated him for a time, they dreaded the possibility of a Catholic dynasty. The one comfort his opponents had was that James had no surviving sons. His daughters Mary and Anne were Protestants, and thus, so long as the succession passed through them, England's Protestant future seemed secure. But in 1687, James's second wife, Mary of Modena, announced she was pregnant. She was in her early 30s, still within childbearing years, but her previous attempts to produce a surviving male heir had all failed. Skepticism and ridicule greeted the news. Many assumed it was either wishful thinking or a cover story to keep hopes of a Catholic heir alive. Still, the court went through the motions, and by June 1688 the Queen was preparing for confinement. On the 10th of June, 1688, the announcement came. A boy had been born at St. James's Palace. The infant, named James Francis Edward, was healthy and alive, a legitimate Catholic heir who now displaced his Protestant sisters in the line of succession. For the king, it was a triumph. For his opponents, it was a disaster. And then came the rumour. Whispers spread that Mary of Modena had not given birth at all. Instead, it was claimed a baby had been smuggled into the royal bedchamber inside a warming pan, a covered metal pan filled with hot coals used to warm beds in drafty palaces. The story ran that the Queen, feigning labour, had allowed her attendants to swap in a random child presented as her own, thereby foisting a counterfeit prince on the kingdom. The tale was absurd in its logistics. Smuggling a live baby into a crowded royal chamber filled with courtiers, physicians, and ladies-in-waiting was virtually impossible. In fact, dozens of witnesses had attended the Queen's labour, carefully documenting the event precisely to avoid such accusations. Yet the story stuck. Why? because it confirmed what many already wanted to believe, that James II could not be trusted, that the monarchy was conspiring to deceive, and that the Catholic cause was willing to cheat to survive. The warming pan rumour was repeated in pamphlets, whispered in taverns, and exploited by politicians. It didn't matter that it lacked credibility. In politics, the perception of deception was enough. The new prince was branded illegitimate in the public imagination, and his very existence became the spark that ignited the so-called Glorious Revolution. Later that year, William of Orange, the husband to James's daughter Mary, invaded England with the backing of Protestant nobles. James fled. William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs, and the infant boy, the warming pan baby himself, was bundled into exile with his parents. The boy grew up abroad, known derisively in England as the Old Pretender. His claim to the throne sparked the Jacobite cause, a series of uprisings and conspiracies over the next half-century. Yet no matter what he did, he could never shake the cloud of suspicion surrounding his birth. For English Protestants, he was always the warming pan baby, the supposed impostor whose existence justified replacing his father. The irony of the story lies in how effective a simple rumour can be. Unlike Mary's first phantom pregnancy, where the body created an illusion without intent, here the Queen truly had a child, but politics transformed the reality into a lie. The monarchy itself seemed incapable of convincing its people of the most basic truth, that a royal baby was born. The warming pan tale is one of those mysteries that resists resolution. Historians today dismiss it as propaganda, a manufactured slander by James's enemies. But the fact that it worked, that so many were willing to believe a conspiracy involving smuggled infants and deceptive queens, reveals how fragile the monarchy's credibility had become. Once doubt was planted, it grew into revolution. And so the warming pan baby became less about one child and more about the broader question of legitimacy. What makes a monarch real in the eyes of the people? Is it blood, ceremony, or simply belief? For James II and his son, the answer was devastating. Once the story took hold, belief was lost, and with it, the throne itself. But the English crown had not yet exhausted its supply of mysterious children. Less than 2 centuries earlier, 2 royal boys had disappeared altogether, vanishing not in rumour or satire, but in a silence so deep that it still echoes today. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of the monarchy's darkest and most enduring enigmas. From Alfred's burnt cakes to monarchs who claim to heal with a touch, these stories prove that kings and queens were as fragile and as foolish as anyone else. And there are plenty more where that came from. If you're caught up in this strange parade of royal mysteries, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next twist. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is glowing on your clock as you tumble deeper into history's oddities. The Princes in the Tower, 1483. If the warming pan baby was the child that people believed never belonged in the royal bedchamber, then the case of the Princes in the Tower is about 2 children who most certainly did belong there, but who vanished so completely that the silence around their disappearance became louder than any proclamation of succession. Their fate is one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in English history, and perhaps the most haunting. The year was 1483. Edward IV, a powerful yet pragmatic king of the House of York, had died suddenly, leaving his 2-year-old son, Edward V, as heir. The boy was placed under the care of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was tasked with protecting the young king until his coronation. Edward's younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, joined him in the Tower of London, which at the time was not just a prison but also a royal residence and traditional lodging for monarchs before their coronation. But the coronation never happened. Within weeks, the boys were declared illegitimate on the grounds that their father's marriage to their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had supposedly been invalid. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned Richard III. The princes, meanwhile, remained in the tower. At first they were seen playing in the gardens and glimpsed at windows. Then the sightings stopped. By the end of the summer, rumours circulated that the boys were dead. No official announcement was made, but their absence was impossible to ignore. Whispers pointed at Richard III as the likely culprit, the ambitious uncle who needed them out of the way to secure his throne. Some contemporaries believed he had ordered their deaths in secret, smothered in their beds or otherwise quietly disposed of. Others thought they might have been spirited away to safety, hidden by loyalists, their fate left deliberately obscure. The mystery deepened a century and a half later, in 1674, when workmen renovating the tower uncovered a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase. They were hastily reburied in Westminster Abbey, identified as the missing princes, though no conclusive evidence has ever proven it. In 1933, the remains were examined and found to be consistent with children of the right age. But again, certainty remained elusive. DNA testing has been suggested in modern times, but the royal family has resisted disturbing the remains further. So what happened? Historians remain divided. Richard III, of course, is the traditional suspect. The disappearance marred his reputation so badly that centuries later, Shakespeare turned him into one of history's greatest villains, a hunchback tyrant whose ambition led him to murder his nephews. Yet some argue that the true culprit might have been Henry Tudor, Henry VII, who seized power in 1485 after defeating Richard at Bosworth. If the boys had survived Richard, Henry would have had every reason to eliminate them, as their claim to the throne was stronger than his own. The lack of definitive proof has kept the story alive for more than 500 years. The princes are remembered not for what they did, they were children, after all, but for what was done, or possibly done, to them. Their disappearance represents a chilling truth, that monarchy at its core has always been willing to sacrifice innocence for survival. And so the Tower of London, a place of coronations and executions, also became a place of silence. 2 boys entered, heirs to the throne, and then simply vanished. History has debated ever since whether they were murdered, hidden, or lost to time. The enigma itself became part of their legacy, a reminder that sometimes the absence of an answer is more powerful than certainty. If the princes were hidden by stone and secrecy, then Richard III himself would centuries later be hidden by something far less majestic, the asphalt and concrete of a modern-day car park. Richard III, under a car park, 2012. History is rarely neat. For 500 years, Richard III was remembered primarily as the villain who may or may not have killed the princes in the tower, immortalized by Shakespeare as a twisted usurper crying, "My kingdom for a horse." But in 2012, Richard managed a comeback of sorts, not by changing the historical record, but by returning to it physically. His skeleton was found buried beneath an unassuming car park in Leicester, a discovery that combined archaeology, irony, and a sense of cosmic theatre. The search for Richard's grave began as something of a quixotic endeavour. Members of the Richard III Society, determined to rehabilitate his tarnished image, believed he had been buried at Greyfriars Church in Leicester after his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Over centuries, the church had been demolished, its location forgotten, until the area became covered with modern buildings and, eventually, parking lots. Most assumed the grave was lost forever. But in 2012, a team of archaeologists, guided by historical maps and the passionate lobbying of amateur historian Philippa Langley, began digging beneath a car park. On the very first day of excavation, they uncovered a skeleton. It was later confirmed through meticulous analysis. The remains belonged to Richard III. DNA testing matched descendants of his family line. The discovery was so extraordinary, it seemed almost scripted. The skeleton itself told a story. Richard's spine was curved, confirming scoliosis, a condition that would have given him one shoulder higher than the other, but not the monstrous hunchback described by Shakespeare. His bones bore the marks of battle wounds, including fatal injuries to the skull, consistent with accounts of his death on the battlefield. The remains revealed a man who had fought fiercely, dying in combat rather than cowering in cowardice. The re-emergence of Richard's body posed difficult questions. How much of his villainous reputation was propaganda, crafted by the Tudors and immortalized by Shakespeare? Was he truly the child-murdering tyrant? Or simply a king whose reign was cut short by rivals who wrote the history books? The body itself could not answer those questions, but it forced people to look again. Equally striking was the absurdity of the location. The last Plantagenet king of England, defeated in battle, stripped naked, and buried hastily by his enemies, had lain for centuries beneath a car park, his grave unmarked, his memory maligned. Tourists walked over him daily without a thought, paying for tickets and parking meters above the bones of a king. The juxtaposition was perfect. The grandeur of monarchy reduced to tarmac and painted lines. When the discovery was announced, the reaction was immediate and global. Some saw it as vindication, others as an eerie reminder of history's ironies. The remains were eventually reinterred with dignity in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, in a ceremony attended by royalty and clergy. The man once discarded like a criminal was finally laid to rest as a king. And yet, the story did not resolve the deeper mystery of Richard III's life. It answered where he lay, but not whether he had ordered the death of the princes, nor whether he deserved his blackened reputation. In a sense, the grave answered the wrong question. What we gained was not truth, but a symbol. The physical body of a man who had been simultaneously king and villain, now reduced to bones beneath a car park. It is difficult to escape the irony. Richard III spent his short reign trying to control his legacy, and yet his greatest legacy became a discovery centuries later that raised more questions than it answered. And if Richard's bones were uncovered in the 21st century, reminding us of how fragile royal dignity can be, the next story is about another king undone, not by historians or rumours, but by his own dinner plate. For Henry I's love of lampreys, those slippery eel-like creatures, would prove a fatal indulgence. Henry I's fatal surfeit of lampreys, 1135. If Richard III's fate was to lie beneath a car park until modern science dug him up again, Henry I's fate was to lie beneath a dinner plate, felled not by swords or traitors, but by his own stubborn appetite. Of all the ways a king might die on the battlefield, at the end of a dagger, in the midst of conspiracy, Henry I's passing has endured in memory because of fish, not even glamorous fish either. Lampreys, slimy, jawless, parasitic lampreys. Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, came to power in 1100 after the suspiciously convenient death of his brother William Rufus in a hunting accident. Known as Lion of Justice, Henry was a capable and pragmatic ruler who strengthened the monarchy's power and brought some semblance of order to his realm. He reigned for 35 years, which in those days was an impressive stretch of political survival. He was disciplined, meticulous, and not easily swayed. Except, apparently, when it came to food. Henry had a known weakness for lampreys, a delicacy among the nobility. To modern taste, lampreys are peculiar, eel-like, boneless creatures with circular mouths full of teeth, better suited to starring in a horror film than in royal cuisine. Yet in the Middle Ages, they were considered a luxurious dish, rich and flavorful, often prepared with spices and wine. Kings feasted on them at Christmas, nobles gave them as gifts, and Henry I adored them with a devotion that bordered on obsession. By late 1135, Henry was in Normandy, already in declining health. His physicians, recognizing the dangers of overindulgence, warned him against eating lampreys. Their advice was blunt. The fish was too rich for his constitution. He should abstain. Henry, however, was not inclined to be told what he could and could not eat. After all, he was a king, and kings did not take orders from doctors. So, in a gesture of regal stubbornness, he ignored the medical counsel and indulged in what chroniclers called a surfeit of lampreys. Shortly thereafter, Henry fell violently ill. The exact cause has been debated: food poisoning, indigestion, leading to a gastric illness, or perhaps simply an unfortunate coincidence of timing. Whatever the case, he died within days on the 1st of December, 1135, at the age of 67. A lifetime of careful governance was undone by a final meal that his body could not withstand. To contemporaries, the symbolism was irresistible. Chroniclers seized on the detail, turning lampreys into both a cautionary tale and a punchline. Here was a king who had survived battles, rebellions, and dynastic intrigues, only to be toppled by fish. In a world where divine judgment was read into every misfortune, the message was clear. Even a king who ruled with justice could not escape punishment for gluttony and pride. The consequences of his death were catastrophic. Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned years earlier in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving Henry without a male heir. He had designated his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his successor, extracting oaths from the barons to support her. But upon his death, the nobles balked at accepting a female ruler, and instead rallied around Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. The result was nearly 2 decades of civil war, known as the Anarchy, a brutal struggle that plunged England into chaos. Thus, the Lamprey feast was more than a quirky royal anecdote. It was the hinge upon which history swung. Had Henry listened to his doctors, abstained, and lived a few more years, Matilda might have ascended smoothly. Instead, his indulgence set the stage for prolonged conflict, bloodshed, and national instability. A surfeit of lampreys became not just a dietary mistake but a political disaster. Modern readers, with their love of irony, can hardly resist the humour. Imagine a man who controlled kingdoms, made laws, and bent nobles to his will, undone because he couldn't resist a plate of slimy eels. His epitaph could almost read, "Here lies Henry, master of men, defeated by dinner." But the humour masks a deeper truth about monarchy. Kings may command armies, but they cannot command their own mortality. Power ends not only in assassination or rebellion, but in digestion, in biology, in a stubborn refusal to heed advice. Henry's lampreys remind us that the line between majesty and mortality is very, very thin. And if Henry I's end was a lesson in culinary arrogance, his descendant Henry II would face a very different kind of humiliation, not in the banquet hall, but barefoot, before the tomb of a murdered archbishop, submitting to the lash in an act of royal penance that shocked Christendom. Henry II's public penance, 1174. If Henry I died from eating too much, his grandson Henry II is remembered for an act of doing far too little, at least, too little to control his own nights. His reign, otherwise brilliant and expansive, was forever overshadowed by the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. 4 years later, Henry was forced into one of the most dramatic displays of royal penance in medieval history, submitting to public flogging at the saint's tomb. Henry II was no ordinary king. He built the Angevin Empire, ruling not only England but vast swathes of France, stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. He was intelligent, driven, and famously short-tempered. His quarrel with Becket was born from that temper and his determination to assert royal control over the church. Becket, once his close friend and chancellor, had been made Archbishop of Canterbury, under the assumption he would serve Henry's interests. Instead, Becket transformed into an uncompromising defender of ecclesiastical independence. Their friendship dissolved into bitter conflict, punctuated by Henry's legendary outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether Henry meant it as an order or a frustrated exclamation, his knights took him literally. In December 1170, 4 of them rode to Canterbury, confronted Becket in the cathedral, and killed him before the altar. The shocking act reverberated across Europe. Becket was hailed as a martyr, canonized within 3 years, and his tomb became a site of pilgrimage. Henry, meanwhile, was tainted with blame. Though he had not struck the blow, his angry words had unleashed it. For years, Henry struggled with the shadow of Becket's death, his political enemies, and even his own family using it against him. In 1174, facing rebellion from his sons and invasion from the King of Scotland, Henry realized he needed divine favor restored. And so, in one of the most astonishing acts of royal humility ever recorded, he made a pilgrimage to Canterbury. There, barefoot and wearing sackcloth, Henry approached Becket's tomb. In full view of churchmen and commoners, the most powerful monarch in Christendom knelt in penance. Monks flogged him. Accounts say each monk gave him several lashes, while Henry submitted without protest. He then spent the night in vigil at the tomb, praying for forgiveness. The spectacle was both shocking and theatrical. A king, normally untouchable, allowed himself to be whipped like a sinner in the marketplace. Was it genuine repentance or brilliant political theatre? Probably both. The effect was immediate. Becket's cult flourished even more. Pilgrims streamed to Canterbury, and Henry's fortunes revived. Within days of his penance, his forces defeated the Scottish king at Alnwick, which contemporaries interpreted as divine approval. Historians continue to debate Henry's motives. Was it sincere remorse for a friend-turned-enemy's death, or cold calculation to secure legitimacy? Perhaps the answer lies in the contradiction. Henry was a man capable of deep feeling and ruthless pragmatism at once. His penance was both a confession of guilt and a masterstroke of image management. The irony is clear. The same king who once fumed against Becket was forced to kneel at his tomb, whipped into humility. A monarch who sought to dominate the church ended up validating its power through his submission. The man who tried to control every detail of his empire had to accept that his legacy would forever be linked to the words he could not unsay. And yet, in that submission, Henry gained what William the Conqueror and Henry I had lost, a measure of redemption. For a moment, at least, he turned scandal into sanctity. But if Henry II demonstrated humility before the power of the divine, his predecessor King Cnut had once staged a very different kind of spectacle. Standing by the sea and commanding the tide itself to retreat, a story told for centuries, not as a symbol of arrogance, but of wisdom about the limits of royal power. King Cnut and the Tide. If Henry II's penance before the tomb of Thomas Becket was a reminder that kings must sometimes bow to the church, the legend of King Cnut and the Tide serves as a reminder that kings must also bow to nature. But unlike Becket's story, in which Henry's rage unleashed a murder that forced him into humility, the tale of Cnut places humility right at its centre, or, depending on how you read it, subtle sarcasm about the absurdity of courtiers. Cnut, or Cnut, as the Victorians preferred to spell it, was no weakling monarch. A Danish prince who came to rule England in 1016, he carved out a North Sea empire that stretched across Denmark, Norway, parts of Sweden, and even into the British Isles. He was a king of warriors and a master of strategy. And yet, centuries later, he is remembered not for battles or laws, but for standing on a beach and giving orders to the sea. The story as we know it does not appear until a century later in Henry of Huntingdon's 12th century chronicle, which means it must be treated more as legend than literal record. According to the tale, Cnut had grown weary of the endless flattery of his courtiers, who insisted that nothing was beyond his power, that the very elements would bend to his command. To expose their sycophancy for what it was, he devised a demonstration. Cnut had his throne carried to the seashore. Seated regally, he raised his hand and commanded the waves to halt, forbidding the tide to advance any further. The sea, indifferent to royal decrees, naturally continued its advance, lapping at his feet and, eventually, soaking him. Cnut turned to his courtiers and declared that earthly kings held no power over the forces of nature. Only God commanded such things, and therefore it was folly to heap divine-level praise upon mortal rulers. On its face, the story is a neat morality play. A king teaching his flatterers a lesson in humility, reminding them of the limits of human authority. It is often told even today, usually as a way to mock arrogant politicians who think they can stop inevitable forces. And yet, the irony is that the tale is often misrepresented. In the popular imagination, Cnut is portrayed as a fool who genuinely believed he could control the tide, rather than the clever king who staged the event to make a point about human limitations. His act of humility became twisted into an anecdote about arrogance. The distortion itself is telling. People tend to prefer stories that mock rulers rather than those that flatter them, and so over time Cnut's deliberate demonstration of wisdom was inverted into a tale of vanity. This reversal makes the story more useful for satirists, even if it obscures the original intent. It also highlights the paradox of monarchy. Kings depend on image, but they cannot control how that image will be remembered. Still, the symbolic weight of the story is powerful. Cnut, a man who commanded armies across seas, acknowledged that the sea itself was beyond him. Unlike William the Conqueror bursting in his coffin or Henry I feasting himself into political disaster, Cnut recognized the inevitability of forces greater than himself. Whether told as a morality tale or a satire, the scene endures because it dramatizes the contradiction at the heart of kingship, the desire for absolute control, undone by realities that cannot be commanded. It is also worth noting that the sea had a special resonance in Cnut's reign. His empire was maritime, built on control of waterways and coasts. He was, in a sense, a ruler of tides, at least the figurative kind, created by commerce and conquest. To stand against the literal tide was therefore a loaded gesture, a way of showing that even the ruler of the waves was ultimately at the mercy of the ocean. Cnut's humility, or his perceived arrogance depending on which version of the tale you prefer, invites comparison to his successors. Many kings after him would lose their crowns to forces beyond their control, rebellion, disease, political betrayal. But Cnut's beachside demonstration is memorable precisely because it strips the idea of kingship down to its bare bones. No matter how large your empire, no matter how many crowns you collect, the tide will still come in and you will still get your feet wet. And it is that stark reminder of humanity that makes the next story even more peculiar. Because if Cnut is remembered for acknowledging human limits, Alfred the Great is remembered for ignoring them, so consumed with his kingdom's survival that he forgot the most ordinary of tasks, burning a peasant woman's cakes while hiding from Viking invaders. Where Cnut's story is about deliberate humility, Alfred's is about accidental humiliation. proof that even a great king could be scolded like a clumsy servant in someone else's kitchen. Alfred the Great burns the cakes. If King Cnut's lesson with the tide taught that no monarch could command nature, Alfred the Great's legendary misadventure with cakes taught that no monarch could escape the petty humiliations of domestic life. Alfred, who reigned in the late 9th century, is often remembered as the model king of the Anglo-Saxon era. Warrior, lawgiver, patron of learning, and the man who fought back against the Viking onslaught. And yet, for all his strategic brilliance and statesmanship, he is just as often remembered for a moment of culinary incompetence. The tale originates from accounts written decades after Alfred's reign, and it reads almost like a parable told around the hearth rather than a political history. According to the story, sometime around 878, Alfred was in dire straits. Viking armies had overrun much of his kingdom of Wessex, and he was forced into hiding. Stripped of the trappings of royalty, Alfred sought refuge in the marshes of Somerset, moving quietly among his people while plotting his eventual comeback. During this period of retreat, Alfred was said to have taken shelter with a peasant woman who, not recognizing her royal guest, treated him like any other weary traveler. She tasked him with a simple chore, to keep an eye on some cakes she was baking over the fire. Alfred, lost in thought, was consumed with the problems of his kingdom, the strategies he must employ, the alliances he must secure, the survival of his people. In his distraction, he neglected the cakes. They burned. The woman returned, saw the charred remains of her bread, and scolded Alfred harshly, berating him for his uselessness. "You're quick enough to eat them," she is said to have snapped, "but too lazy to turn them while they bake." And the king, who commanded armies and dreamed of driving out Viking invaders, stood humiliated before the angry housewife, chastised like a negligent child. Whether or not the story is true hardly matters. It became part of Alfred's legend precisely because it reflected the paradox of kingship. Here was a man destined to save his kingdom reduced to a figure of ridicule over something as mundane as burnt food. It humanized him, grounding the heroism of his reign in the ordinary reality of domestic life. For a king so celebrated, the reminder that he could be scolded like anyone else only amplified his myth. But the story also served as moral instruction. In the medieval imagination, the burning of cakes symbolized the dangers of neglect, of allowing one's mind to drift from the task at hand. Alfred's distraction was understandable. He was burdened with the weight of a nation, but the tale suggested that even the great must mind the small. Kingship, like baking, required attention, patience, and humility. The irony is that Alfred's retreat in the marshes ultimately paved the way for his greatest victory. From those humble beginnings, he rallied his forces and defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington, securing Wessex and laying the foundations for a united England. The man who burned cakes went on to shape history, his humiliation serving as a temporary punctuation in an otherwise triumphant narrative. It is a curious legacy, a king remembered both for his learning and laws and for his clumsiness in a kitchen, and perhaps that is why the story endures. It reassures us that greatness does not erase humanity, that even the most celebrated rulers sometimes fumble with the ordinary. Yet while Alfred's tale is remembered as legend, the monarchy's connection to miraculous powers became, in later centuries, something far stranger and far more official. For centuries, English monarchs were believed to wield a healing touch, a divine gift said to cure the sick with nothing more than a king's hand. The king's touch for Scrofula. If Alfred the Great's burnt cakes taught humility, the belief in the king's touch displayed the opposite. The idea that monarchs were not just rulers, but living conduits of divine power. From the Middle Ages until the 18th century, English and later British Kings and queens were thought to possess the ability to cure Scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swollen lymph nodes in the neck. The disease, sometimes called the king's evil, left patients disfigured and suffering. And yet, for hundreds of years, sufferers flocked to royal courts, believing that a touch from the sovereign could heal them. The practice likely began in the 11th century with Edward the Confessor, whose piety made him a natural candidate for miracle stories. Chroniclers claimed he could cure by touch, and later monarchs adopted the tradition, reinforcing their authority as rulers chosen by God. The ritual varied, but usually involved the monarch laying hands on the afflicted, sometimes accompanied by prayers, and often bestowing a token, a coin or medal known as a touch piece, as a tangible symbol of healing. For those who believed, the experience must have felt electric. Imagine being a poor villager suffering from a chronic disease, summoned into the presence of a monarch in rich robes, surrounded by ceremony and incense. To have the king or queen place a hand upon you was not just a medical treatment, it was a brush with the sacred. Even if the disease did not vanish, the ritual offered hope, comfort, and a sense of belonging to the divine order. The practice persisted for centuries. Henry VII performed it. Elizabeth I did too, though her Protestant leanings made her more cautious about overt displays of miracle working. But the tradition reached almost surreal heights in the Stuart period. Charles II, in particular, was famous for his enthusiasm for the king's touch. He is said to have touched nearly 100,000 people during his reign, an astonishing number that suggests the ceremony was as much about spectacle as healing. One of the most remarkable moments in this tradition came in 1712, when Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, touched a sickly infant named Samuel Johnson. The child grew up to become the famous writer and lexicographer, author of the first great English dictionary. Though Johnson's scrofula was not cured, he carried the memory of being touched by the Queen for the rest of his life. The incident illustrates both the futility and the symbolic weight of the ritual. It rarely cured, but it bestowed identity, linking ordinary subjects to their sovereign through the promise of divine grace. The practice eventually fell out of favour. Enlightenment, rationalism, and medical advances undermined the belief in miraculous healing by monarchs. By the time of George I, the Hanoverian king who ascended in 1714, the ritual was abandoned altogether. George, a pragmatic German Protestant, dismissed it as superstition, severing the mystical link between the crown and the cure. Yet the memory lingers. The idea that kings and queens could heal by touch speaks volumes about how monarchy functioned not merely as political authority, but as a sacred role, a performance that blurred the line between religion, medicine, and theatre. It was less about actually curing disease and more about reinforcing the belief that the sovereign was special, chosen, infused with a grace that set them apart from common mortals. If the king's touch reveals the mystical side of monarchy, the next tale reveals its grotesque side. For Charles II, the same king who tirelessly laid his hands on the sick, also imbibed a peculiar potion known as the king's drops, a fashionable medicine rumoured to be distilled from human skulls. From miracle worker to corpse medicine connoisseur, Charles's reign shows just how bizarre royal remedies could become. Charles II's king's drops. If the king's touch displayed the monarch as a conduit of divine healing, then Charles II's favourite medicine, the so-called king's drops, revealed a darker side of royal remedies, where faith, science, and the grotesque merged into one bitter draught. It is one of those strange moments in history where the image of a king, so polished in portraiture and ceremony, collides with the raw, unsettling practices of early modern medicine. Charles II, the Merry Monarch, restored the monarchy in 1660 after years of Cromwell's dour republicanism. He was witty, charming, fond of theatre, mistresses, and pageantry. But behind the velvet and the wit was a man plagued by ill health, constantly seeking treatments to prolong his life and keep him vigorous. In an age before germ theory, when physicians prescribed everything from bleeding to bezoar stones, Charles indulged in the strangest remedies available. Among them was the famous tincture known as King's Drops. The concoction, according to contemporary accounts, was made with alcohol infused with powdered fragments of human skull. That's right, Charles drank medicine derived from corpses. To modern readers, this sounds horrific, but in the 17th century, it was surprisingly mainstream. Corpse medicine, as historians call it, had been popular across Europe for centuries. Physicians prescribed powdered mummy, often obtained from looted Egyptian tombs, human fat for ointments, and even blood as curatives. The skull, in particular, was believed to treat ailments of the head. Consuming the essence of the dead was thought to channel their vitality into the living. Charles did not invent this. He inherited it from a broader medical culture where alchemy, superstition, and emerging science mixed freely. But the fact that a reigning king embraced such remedies lent them prestige. The King's Drops became fashionable, sold and consumed by others eager to imitate the royal example. If the king trusted corpse medicine, then surely it must work. The irony is sharp. Charles, celebrated as a man of modern wit and worldly charm, was also a patron of medical practices that today seem macabre. He sponsored the Royal Society, championed scientific inquiry, and surrounded himself with learned men. Yet even in that circle of intellectual ferment, he turned to skull tinctures when his body ached. It is a reminder that progress is never neat. The age that produced Isaac Newton also produced Charles's drops. Did they work? Almost certainly not. But medicine in that era often served less as cure and more as ritual, a performance of care, a way to reassure the patient that something was being done. And for a monarch, such remedies carried symbolic weight. Drinking the essence of the dead might have suggested resilience, a defiance of mortality, an appropriation of vitality from beyond the grave. Or perhaps it was simply another indulgence, like the plays and the mistresses, adopted because it promised pleasure or relief. The detail has endured because it captures a contradiction. Charles II, the king of laughter and lightness, swigging a draught infused with bone dust, embodies the surreal edge of monarchy, glamour and grotesque in one body. His reign restored pageantry after Puritan austerity, but his drops remind us that the glitter of kingship always floated above darker currents. And as if the drops weren't strange enough, Charles's death a few decades later would show just how desperate and bizarre royal medicine could become when the physicians themselves took charge. Charles II's last illness, 1685. The death of Charles II reads like a tragic farce, a comedy of errors written in bloodletting and blistering ointments. For all his charm and merriment in life, his final days were anything but merry. They were a grim display of 17th century medicine at its most frantic, and they left the king battered not by disease alone but by the very treatments meant to save him. In early February 1685, Charles suffered a sudden collapse, perhaps a stroke or kidney failure, modern historians suggest. He recovered briefly, but soon his condition worsened. Alarmed, his physicians descended upon him, armed with the full arsenal of contemporary medicine. What followed was not healing but a systematic assault on the king's body. They bled him, not once but repeatedly, draining large quantities of blood in the belief that it would rebalance his humours. They purged him with laxatives and emetics, forcing his body to expel supposed toxins. They applied blistering agents, substances designed to raise painful blisters on the skin, thought to draw illness outward. They shaved his head and applied poultices of pigeon dung to his feet. Yes, pigeon dung. If Lampreys had killed Henry I, pigeon dung nearly finished Charles II faster than the disease itself. The treatments piled on. Potions of herbs, enemas, more bleedings. By the time they were finished, Charles had endured over 50 interventions in just a few days. His body, weakened by illness, could not withstand the onslaught. On the 6th of February, 1685, he died at the age of 54. Contemporaries mourned him as the Merry Monarch, but the manner of his death exposed the brutality of pre-modern medicine. His physicians, desperate to demonstrate their diligence, threw every remedy they knew at him, regardless of whether it helped. In the end, their efforts were more torturous than curative. The king who had restored joy to England died in misery, covered in blisters and drained of blood. Historians often remark on the irony. Charles II, who had delighted in theatre and masquerade, became himself the centre of a grim performance staged by his doctors. His sickbed was a theatre of medicine, where each treatment was less about curing the patient and more about performing knowledge, reassuring the court that nothing was left undone. It was spectacle masquerading as science. And yet, even in death, Charles II's reputation softened the blow. He had lived as a man of laughter, and so people remembered him that way, even if his final hours were soaked in agony. His death became another reminder of the fragility of kingship, the way a sovereign's body could become a battleground for the competing theories of the age. The irony of his death did not end there, for only decades earlier, England had seen what could happen when the body of a king, or rather a king's enemy, was subjected not to medical assault, but to posthumous vengeance. If Charles's body was tortured in life by doctors, Oliver Cromwell's was tortured in death by monarchists seeking symbolic revenge. His corpse would be dug up, hanged, and displayed, proving that even the grave was no guarantee of peace for those who crossed kings. Oliver Cromwell punished. After death, 1661. If Charles II's physicians tortured him with their remedies while he was still alive, his great political enemy, Oliver Cromwell, suffered a different kind of torture long after he was dead. Cromwell, the man who had toppled the monarchy, executed a king, and ruled as Lord Protector, became the ultimate symbol of regicide and rebellion. And when Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, vengeance followed swiftly, extending even into the grave. Cromwell had died in 1658, 3 years before the Restoration, and was buried with all the pomp of a head of state in Westminster Abbey. His funeral was modelled on royal ceremonies, complete with heraldry and grandeur. For a moment, it seemed as though the republic he had fought for might outlive him, enshrining his memory in the same sacred ground as England's kings. But politics moves fast, and graves are not as permanent as marble suggests. When Charles II reclaimed the throne, one of his first acts was to settle scores. Cromwell, though long dead, was still enemy number one in the eyes of royalists. His very presence in Westminster Abbey was an affront to the restored monarchy. Parliament declared him guilty of treason retroactively, alongside other leading figures of the regicide. But Cromwell's body could not be left to rest in honour. It had to be humiliated, made into an example, a symbol of what awaited anyone who dared raise a hand against the crown. So, in January 1661, Cromwell's corpse was exhumed from Westminster Abbey, along with the remains of fellow regicides Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw. The bodies, already decayed, were taken to Tyburn, the traditional site of executions. There, in a grotesque parody of justice, they were hanged in chains, as though the corpses could feel the punishment. Afterward, they were beheaded, their bodies thrown into a pit, their skulls placed on pikes outside Westminster Hall, For Cromwell, the irony was complete. In life, he had fought to strip kings of their divine aura, to insist that even monarchs were accountable to law. In death, his body was subjected to the rituals of monarchy inverted. Instead of royal burial, he received royal vengeance. The exhumation was not about punishing a man, it was about punishing his memory, erasing his legitimacy, and warning the living that rebellion would not be forgiven, even in retrospect. The head, displayed prominently, became a macabre tourist attraction. For decades, it loomed as a silent warning, a skull weathered by rain and wind, staring down from its spike. Eventually, it disappeared, only to resurface centuries later in private collections. In the 20th century, after much debate, it was quietly buried at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge Cromwell's alma mater. Even in death, his journey was restless, his remains wandering across England like the ghost of a controversy that never quite settled. The episode illustrates the performative nature of monarchy. Charles II did not exhume Cromwell because it accomplished anything practical. He did it because symbols matter. A monarchy restored had to show it would not tolerate dissent, not even the memory of it. The desecration of Cromwell's corpse was less an act of justice and more an act of theatre, a grisly play staged for the political imagination of a nation. And yet, the punishment revealed something else too, that kings feared not only the living, but the dead. Cromwell's body was powerless, but his memory was potent. His example had to be mutilated so that no myth of heroic republicanism could grow around it. In the monarchy's eyes, even bones could be dangerous. If Cromwell's corpse was punished for his rebellion, Queen Victoria's corpse became a vessel for sentiment laden not with dishonour, but with secret tokens of devotion. When she was buried in 1901, her body carried hidden keepsakes of her deepest attachments, including one that the public was never meant to know. Victoria's Burial Keepsakes, 1901. The funeral of Queen Victoria, by contrast, was not about punishment, but about concealment. If Cromwell's body was stripped of honour to erase his rebellion, Victoria's was swaddled with tokens to preserve her most private affections. When the longest reigning monarch of her time died in January 1901, her burial became a carefully choreographed ritual. Yet, beneath the grandeur, there were secrets slipped into her coffin, objects that spoke not of empire or public duty, but of personal love and hidden loyalties. Victoria had lived a life of contradictions. To her subjects, she was the embodiment of moral rectitude, the widow who wore black for 40 years after the death of her beloved Prince Albert. But in her private life, she was far less simple. After Albert's death in 1861, she formed an intensely close relationship with John Brown, a Scottish servant whose loyalty, companionship, and blunt honesty won her heart. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated endlessly, friendship, romance, or something in between. But what mattered was that Brown became indispensable to her, much to the irritation of her family and courtiers. When Victoria died, her instructions for her burial included surprising details. She wished to be laid to rest not only with mementos of Albert, his dressing gown, a cast of his hand, but also with tokens of John Brown. Into her coffin went a lock of his hair and a photograph of him, placed discreetly in her hand. For the public, the image of Victoria was the grieving widow of Albert. For those who prepared her body, it was clear she also wished to carry Brown with her into eternity. These keepsakes complicate her image. Historians long painted Victoria as dour and humourless, but the burial tokens reveal a woman fiercely devoted to those she loved, unwilling to let even death sever her attachments. They also highlight the tension between public monarchy and private emotion. The empire expected a queen who embodied duty and propriety. What it got was a woman who insisted on smuggling her heart into her coffin, even if it meant shocking her descendants. The secrecy mattered. Brown had been controversial in life, and after Victoria's death, her family tried to erase evidence of their closeness. Letters were destroyed, records suppressed. Yet the keepsakes in her coffin defied that erasure. They were Victoria's final word, sealed into her body itself. For all the family's efforts to sanitize her memory, she ensured that her truth, however cryptic, would accompany her into the grave. The keepsakes also underscore the irony of monarchy. Royals are supposed to belong to history, their lives consumed by duty, their bodies staged as public property. Yet Victoria, in the most private of gestures, reclaimed her body as her own, filling her coffin with the objects of her choosing. In doing so, she blurred the line between the sovereign and the woman, between the icon of empire and the widow with a broken heart. It is tempting to see the gesture as rebellious, a quiet defiance of the royal script. Cromwell's body had been exhumed to strip him of meaning. Victoria's body was buried with keepsakes that defied control, slipping past the censors of her family and the expectations of her subjects. Both show how bodies, long after death, become battlegrounds of memory. And while Victoria's secrets lay hidden in her coffin, her palace itself would, not long after, become vulnerable to secrets of another kind, unwelcome intrusions by strangers. For the monarchy that could bury its truths where the Queen could not stop the curious, the obsessed, and the reckless from slipping past its guards. Among the most notorious of these was a boy barely a teenager who repeatedly broke into Buckingham Palace, earning a place in history as Boye Jones. Boye Jones, serial teen intruder, 1832nd. If Queen Victoria's coffin carried her most intimate secrets, her palace carried a vulnerability that was far more public. Monarchy in the 19th century projected an image of grandeur and inviolability, but the curious adventures of a teenager known to history as Boye Jones revealed just how fragile the royal bubble could be. He was not an assassin, not a mastermind of espionage, but a restless young man from the streets who slipped into Buckingham Palace repeatedly during the 1832nd, exposing the embarrassing reality that the heart of the monarchy could be breached with alarming ease. His real name was Edward Jones, born into obscurity, the son of a tailor from Westminster. He had no fortune, no connections, and no legitimate claim to fame. And yet, by sheer audacity or perhaps boredom, he made himself the most notorious intruder of Queen Victoria's reign. His first known intrusion came in December 1838, when Victoria was still a young queen. Somehow, Jones managed to infiltrate Buckingham Palace, creeping through its halls, rifling through rooms, and even reaching her private quarters. When he was caught, he carried with him pieces of the Queen's underwear. This detail alone ensured his notoriety. The idea that a street urchin could not only enter the palace but leave with such intimate tokens was a scandal the monarchy could scarcely contain. Newspapers seized on the story, balancing mockery with outrage. How could the security of the sovereign be so lax? How could a teenager accomplish what foreign spies and anarchists could not? Jones was arrested, questioned, and punished lightly. But that did not stop him. Over the next several years, he returned to the palace multiple times, slipping past guards, hiding in chimneys, and exploring the royal residence with astonishing boldness. On one occasion, he was discovered beneath a sofa. On another, he was found wandering the kitchens, apparently trying to disguise himself as a servant. Each time, he seemed to prove that the monarchy's walls were far less impenetrable than advertised. The fascination with Jones grew. Crowds gathered outside police stations when he was arrested, eager to glimpse the boy who had made a fool of the palace guard. Newspapers reported each new intrusion with glee, casting him alternately as a scamp, a folk hero, or a national embarrassment. For the monarchy, it was mortifying. Victoria, already under pressure as a young queen, had to endure public jokes about her supposed inability to secure her own home. Authorities eventually took drastic steps. Jones was pressed into the Navy, a transparent attempt to remove him from London and its temptations. Later, when he returned, he was shipped off to Australia, a one-way ticket to exile disguised as punishment. Yet, even in banishment, his legend followed him. The image of the boy Jones persisted. The ordinary lad who invaded the most extraordinary of palaces, a reminder that sometimes the biggest threat to monarchy is not regicide but ridicule. The irony is that his intrusions caused no harm beyond embarrassment. He carried no weapons, hatched no plots. His motives remain unclear. Was it thrill-seeking, curiosity, or simply the allure of forbidden spaces? Whatever the case, his story endures because it punctures the image of royal invincibility. Kings and queens may command nations, but they cannot always command locked doors. If Jones's teenage pranks exposed the monarchy's vulnerabilities in the 19th century, another intruder would prove the point even more starkly in the 20th. This time, it was no boyish prankster, but a troubled man who slipped into Buckingham Palace in 1982 and found himself in the Queen's bedroom. Michael Fagan, 1982. Nearly 150 years after Boy Jones humiliated the monarchy with his daring escapades, Buckingham Palace again found itself the scene of intrusion. But this time, it was not a mischievous adolescent, but a grown man whose bizarre break-in exposed not only the frailty of palace security, but also the strange vulnerability of Queen Elizabeth II herself. The story of Michael Fagan in 1982 has become one of the most surreal episodes of modern royal history. Fagan was an unemployed decorator from North London, an ordinary man leading an unsettled life. On the morning of the 9th of July, 1982, he managed to scale the palace walls, climb a drain pipe, and enter through an unlocked window. It was not his first time he had broken in weeks earlier, wandering undetected through the palace, drinking wine, and even sitting on the throne. But this second intrusion was the one that made history, because he found his way into the Queen's bedroom. Accounts differ on what exactly happened next. Some say Elizabeth awoke to find Fagan sitting on her bed, speaking incoherently about his troubles. Others suggest she remained calm, engaging him in conversation until help arrived. What is certain is that the Queen was alone with him for several minutes. No guards, no footmen, no alarms, just the sovereign of the United Kingdom face to face with an intruder in her most private space. The episode was a scandal of security. How could one man, with no plan and no training, penetrate the most guarded residence in Britain not once but twice? The revelations that followed were damning. Alarms had been faulty, guards inattentive, and the palace's reliance on tradition had blinded it to modern risks. Parliament and the press erupted with criticism, demanding answers. Fagan himself became an unlikely figure of fascination. He was not a terrorist or a spy, but a troubled individual expressing grievances about unemployment, politics, and his personal life. His intrusion was both farcical and unsettling, a man climbing into a palace to unburden himself to a queen who had spent her life insulated from ordinary woes. For some, the encounter symbolized the gulf between monarch and subject, suddenly collapsed in the intimacy of a bedroom conversation. The monarchy survived the embarrassment, but the event left a mark. It revealed the fragility of the royal bubble in an age of modern media. No matter how carefully cultivated the image of dignity and security, one man with a drainpipe and determination could reduce it to absurdity. In a sense, Fagan was Boy Jones reborn for the television era. Both were ordinary figures, both slipped past guards, both revealed how the crown's grandeur could be undermined by the simplest intrusion. The difference was that Jones carried away scandalous souvenirs, while Fagan carried away a story that would haunt palace security for decades. And yet, for all its strangeness, Fagan's intrusion was not the only royal death or embarrassment in the 18th century that revealed the vulnerability of kingship. Not long after the age of lamprey feasts and warming pan scandals, George II himself would collapse on the toilet, proving once again that royal dignity can evaporate in the most undignified of places. George II dies on the toilet, 1760. If Michael Fagan's midnight stroll into the Queen's bedroom stripped the monarchy of its aura of inviolability, the death of George II did something similar but with a darker comedy of its own. For here was a king, ruler of Britain and Ireland in the mid-18th century, whose reign had witnessed wars, political evolution, and the consolidation of Hanoverian power. And yet, his final moment came not on the battlefield, not in courtly ceremony, not even in the quiet dignity of a royal bedchamber, but on what was delicately described as his close stool, the Georgian equivalent of a toilet. George II had reigned since 1727, a monarch who had always seemed both stubbornly ordinary and stubbornly irritable. He was not a king who inspired much awe. Volatile, hot-tempered, and blunt, he was often mocked for his accent, his squabbles with his ministers, and his estrangements from his own children. And yet, he presided over a significant period in Britain's development: the rise of cabinet government, the flourishing of trade, and the expansion of empire. He had fought in battle himself at Dettingen in 1743, the last British monarch to do so, and could hardly be accused of cowardice. But all that martial energy, all that imperial presence, was undercut in October 1760 when the king rose from his bed, entered his closet, and collapsed mid-relief. The official diagnosis was an aortic dissection, a sudden rupture of the great artery that sends blood from the heart to the rest of the body. Death would have been swift, unexpected, and unstoppable by any medicine of the time. His attendants found him lifeless, a king felled not by conspiracies or calamities, but by the silent betrayal of his own body. His end, however, could not escape the irony of its setting. The death of a monarch is never a private matter. It is recorded, dissected, and retold endlessly. And so the detail of George II's location at the time of death, his toilet, entered history. Courtiers could have omitted it, could have softened the circumstances, but the truth was too plain to erase. Instead, it became part of the narrative, as much a part of his reign's conclusion as any proclamation of succession. To his contemporaries, there was both shock and amusement. Death on the close stool seemed ignominious, a reminder that even kings are subject to the same indignities as their subjects. Satirists and pamphleteers whispered gleefully about the scene, while moralists interpreted it as another divine lesson in humility. The mighty, in the end, must sit like everyone else. Yet George II's death also carried symbolism beyond the bathroom door. His reign had always been marked by contradictions. A German king ruling Britain, a warrior mocked as petty, a monarch who presided over the maturing of parliamentary government even as he bristled against the loss of his own prerogatives. To die on the toilet was, in a sense, the perfect encapsulation of his place in history, simultaneously important and ridiculous, grand and absurd, human and royal. Posterity has not been especially kind to George II. He is often remembered as a transitional figure, overshadowed by the drama of his father George I and the looming reign of his grandson George III. Yet his death, curiously, is one of the few details that refuses to fade. While his achievements are relegated to footnotes about ministerial politics and military campaigns, the story of his fatal morning visit endures as though history itself decided that this, not Dettingen, or Walpole, or Hanoverian policy, would be his most lasting anecdote. There is a pattern here, one seen again and again in the lives of monarchs. They strive for majesty, but their legacies are often defined by humiliations. William the Conqueror bursting at his funeral, John losing his jewels in the wash, Henry I felled by lampreys, Charles II blistered by pigeon dung, and now George II expiring on his stool. Mortality, in all its banal inevitability, intrudes on ceremony and strips away the illusion of permanence. And yet, if George II's death seemed like a cruel joke, the next story shows how death could just as easily be reinterpreted as providence. For when William III died in 1702 after his horse stumbled on a molehill, his Jacobite enemies toasted the event as the work of a tiny assassin, the little gentleman in black velvet, where George II's death made him ridiculous. William III's made him the target of irony so sharp it turned into political legend. William III's fatal molehill, 1702. The death of George II on the toilet seemed like the sort of punchline that history delights in handing out to monarchs who try too hard to look invincible. But William III's death, a generation earlier, was stranger still. For where George II was undone by his own arteries, William was undone by something so small, so laughably ordinary, that it became immortalized in satire, a molehill. William of Orange had not come to the English throne in the usual way. He arrived by invitation, with ships and soldiers, during the glorious revolution of 1688. He and his wife Mary, daughter of the deposed James II, were installed as joint monarchs. William was not the warmest of rulers, reserved, asthmatic, and often absent-minded, but he was shrewd and dogged, determined to secure Protestant succession and keep Catholic powers like France at bay. His reign saw England tied more tightly into European wars and alliances. He was, in short, a serious king for serious times. Yet seriousness counts for little when your horse stumbles. In February 1702, William was riding in the grounds of Hampton Court when his horse tripped over what was later described as a molehill. The fall was violent enough to break his collarbone. Though not immediately fatal, the injury weakened him. Within weeks, complications set in his already fragile health declined, and he succumbed to pneumonia in March. He was 51 years old. A king toppled not by war, not by assassination, not by politics, but by the subterranean labor of a mole. The irony was too delicious for his enemies to ignore. The Jacobite supporters of the deposed James II and his heirs took the mole as an assassin of Providence. They toasted the little gentleman in black velvet with almost gleeful reverence, celebrating the idea that divine justice had sent a tiny, unseen creature to humble the man who had dethroned their Catholic king. And the phrase stuck. For decades afterward, Jacobite sympathizers raised their glasses to the mole, as though the creature were a secret revolutionary agent. Satirical ballads and pamphlets spread the joke. The mole became an emblem of fate's humor, proof that the grandest powers could be undone by the humblest of forces. To mock William's fall was not just to laugh at the accident, it was to challenge the legitimacy of his reign, reducing his power to the fragility of a rider and his horse. But the molehill death is not just about Jacobite propaganda. It also touches on something deeper, the persistent way history finds meaning in accidents. If a commoner had died from falling off a horse, it would have been dismissed as misfortune. But when a king died this way, it became symbol, allegory, divine judgment. Monarchs, after all, cannot simply die, they must die of something that reflects their reign. William, the foreign-born usurper in the eyes of his critics, died because nature itself rebelled against him. That was the narrative Jacobites spread, and it worked because it was both comic and cutting. Yet William's death also revealed the fragility of the Protestant succession he had fought to secure. With no surviving children of his own, the crown passed to his sister-in-law Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs. The Protestant line survived, but only barely. One might say the mole did more than trip a horse, it nudged the monarchy onto a precarious path that would haunt it for the next century. To modern readers, William's Molehill feels almost too perfect, like a fable written in hindsight. It reminds us of how accidents become myth, how small details expand into political weapons. The mole was never just a mole. It was turned into a symbol of cosmic irony, celebrated in toasts and rhymes long after William's body was in the ground. It proves, once again, that kings are at their most vulnerable, not in the throne room, but in the banalities of life, in lampreys, in stools, in molehills. And yet, not all strange royal stories involve accidents of biology or geology. Sometimes they involve animals deliberately dragged into politics. If a mole could be transformed into a secret assassin, then a dog could be transformed into a demonic familiar. Which brings us to the English Civil War and one of its strangest tales, the story of Prince Rupert's beloved dog Boye, who was accused of being the devil's accomplice in canine form. Prince Rupert's dog Boye. If William III's mole was turned into a Jacobite assassin in fur, then Prince Rupert's dog Boye was transformed into something even stranger, a weapon of propaganda, a scapegoat for paranoia, and a supernatural villain blamed for the royalist cause during the English Civil War. Boye was, in reality, just a dog, a white hunting poodle, affectionate and loyal. But in the 1642nd, at the height of political hysteria, he became the subject of pamphlets, cartoons, and sermons that branded him as the devil's accomplice, a demonic familiar trotting alongside his master. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, nephew of King Charles I, was everything his enemies loved to hate. Tall, dashing, and fearless in battle, Rupert embodied the aristocratic swagger that parliamentarians loathed. He cut a romantic figure, the foreign-born royal who charged into battle with flair, commanding cavalry with almost reckless bravado. He was admired by royalists, despised by parliamentarians, and envied by both. And then there was Boye, who trotted faithfully by his side. At first, Boye was simply a curiosity. Soldiers noticed Rupert's attachment to the dog, who followed him into camps and sometimes even onto the battlefield. But as the war intensified, parliamentarian propagandists seized on Boye's presence, spinning it into a tale of witchcraft and devilry. Pamphlets began to appear, claiming that Boye was no ordinary animal but a familiar spirit sent by Satan himself to aid the royalists. The accusations grew increasingly absurd. Boye, it was said, was invulnerable to bullets, a magical shield for his master. Some claimed he could prophesy the outcome of battles, barking omens to Rupert. Others accused him of shape-shifting, disappearing, or even conversing with the devil in secret. A satirical ballad mocked him as a Lapland lady's imp, suggesting he was the spawn of sorcery from foreign lands. In short, Boye was transformed from a dog into a demonic mascot of everything Parliament hated about the monarchy. The propaganda worked because it tapped into existing fears. The 17th century was still an age of witch trials and demonology. To suggest that a royalist commander was aided by a magical hound was not just comic but sinister. It painted Rupert and his cause as unnatural, godless, and cursed. Even when intended as satire, the claims stuck. spreading anxiety among common soldiers who half believed in supernatural forces lurking behind worldly conflicts. Royalists, of course, turned the accusations on their head. They made Boye into a kind of mascot, proudly displaying him in camp, letting him wander among the troops as a symbol of their defiance. Soldiers laughed at the parliamentarians' paranoia, pointing out that Boye was, in truth, as vulnerable as any animal. Sadly, Boye's end was not symbolic but brutal. In 1644, at the Battle of Marston Moor, one of the decisive clashes of the war, Boye was killed, most likely shot amid the chaos. His death was reported gleefully by parliamentarian pamphleteers who claimed that the devil had finally abandoned his canine form. Some even said the dog's blood turned into ink, a grotesque embellishment meant to reinforce the notion of his otherworldly nature. For Rupert, Boye's death was a personal loss as well as a propaganda blow. The prince, who had been mocked and mythologized through his dog, now found himself bereft of the companion who had followed him faithfully through campfires and battles. Yet Boye's legend outlived him. Even today, history books and articles continue to recount the bizarre tale of the devil dog who supposedly fought for the royalists. The episode illustrates just how eagerly propaganda weaponizes the trivial. A dog, innocent, loyal, and powerless in the greater scheme, was turned into a symbol of everything wicked in the monarchy. Boye was no demon, no sorcerer's familiar. He was merely a dog who loved his master, caught in the whirlwind of political hatred. But his story reminds us how the smallest details of royal life, a pet, a habit, even a molehill, can be distorted into weapons of myth. And if Rupert's Boye was accused of being a familiar of hell, then Elizabeth I, nearly a century earlier, had courted danger not through her pets, but through her own vanity. Her choice of beauty regimen, a white cosmetic known as Venetian ceruse, was every bit as poisonous as the parliamentarians' fictions about Boye. Except in Elizabeth's case, the poison was real, seeping into her skin and legacy alike. Elizabeth I, toxic beauty routine. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, is remembered for her iron will, her political brilliance, and her ability to craft an image that held England together during turbulent times. But that image was not merely metaphorical, it was literally painted onto her face, with layers of thick white makeup that glowed in portraits but hid a darker truth. For the cosmetic that gave Elizabeth her trademark pallor was Venetian ceruse, a compound made with lead, and like so many royal indulgences, it slowly poisoned her. The preference for pale skin in Elizabethan England was not arbitrary. Fairness was associated with nobility, purity, and refinement, while tanned or weathered complexions suggested outdoor labour and lower status. Elizabeth, who had survived smallpox in 1562 and been left with scars on her face, leaned heavily into this cultural ideal. She used Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, to mask blemishes and present herself as the flawless monarch her subjects expected. The effect in portraits was striking. Elizabeth's visage became iconic, a face as pale as porcelain, framed by elaborate ruffs and jeweled gowns, an otherworldly presence meant to inspire awe. But beneath the artifice was a body-absorbing lead day after day. Lead is a neurotoxin, damaging skin, hair, and internal organs over time. It caused the very problems it was supposed to conceal: dryness, wrinkles, and discoloration, leading to even heavier application in an endless, destructive cycle. Elizabeth was not alone in this. Venetian ceruse was fashionable across Europe, sold at high prices as the most refined of cosmetics. But for a monarch whose image was everything, the reliance on it was particularly acute. Elizabeth's reign depended on projecting strength, youth, and vitality long past the age when such qualities naturally fade. Her face became a canvas upon which the monarchy itself was painted. each toxic layer both maintaining and eroding her power. Contemporaries noticed the toll. Observers in her later years remarked on her declining health, her thinning hair, and her increasingly artificial appearance. Yet the Queen pressed on, refusing to appear without her mask of white. Even as her teeth blackened, even as her skin grew fragile, she clung to the image she had built. For Elizabeth, the illusion was not vanity alone, it was politics. To show weakness, to reveal the scars of smallpox or the ravages of age, would have been to invite doubt about her ability to rule. There is irony in abundance here. Elizabeth, famed for her clever manipulation of image, was undone by the very image she curated. The mask that made her appear strong made her body weaker. The paint that signaled purity was itself impure. In striving to embody the myth of the Virgin Queen, she poisoned herself slowly but surely, her body paying the price for the performance of monarchy. Yet her toxic beauty routine also reflects the broader paradox of power. Monarchs are not just rulers, they are symbols, and symbols must sometimes be maintained at any cost. Elizabeth's reliance on Venetian ceruse was not just personal, it was a duty to the myth of her reign. She could not afford to be merely human, blemished and aging. She had to be eternal, immaculate, untouchable. And if that required a poison mask, then so be it. Where Prince Rupert's dog Boye revealed how enemies could weaponize absurd superstition, Elizabeth's face revealed how rulers themselves could weaponize illusion. But both stories end the same way, with myth overtaking reality. For Boye, it was the myth of the devil dog. For Elizabeth, the myth of eternal beauty. And in both cases, the truth was far more fragile. But monarchy is nothing without symbols, and Elizabeth's cosmetic mask was only one of many talismans by which kings and queens anchored their power. In the next tale, a different set of symbols takes center stage. The ravens of the Tower of London, birds said to guard the fate of the kingdom itself, whose continued presence was supposedly ordered by Charles II after the Restoration. Keep the ravens, the Tower of London's feathered guardians. Elizabeth I's white mask of poison showed just how far a monarch might go to project the illusion of power. But what happens when that illusion isn't painted on a face, but feathered, flying, and cawing from the battlements of the Tower of London? Enter one of the most enduring royal superstitions, the ravens of the tower, birds whose presence supposedly ensures the survival of the kingdom itself. The story, as it is usually told, begins with Charles II. In the aftermath of the Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, England was deeply unsettled. The scars of regicide, republicanism, and plague were raw, and superstition ran rampant. Somewhere in this atmosphere, the idea took root that ravens at the Tower of London were not just ornamental scavengers, but guardians of the realm. According to legend, Charles II was warned that if the ravens ever left the tower, both the fortress and the kingdom would collapse. Charles, whose reign was filled with theatrical flourishes, supposedly ordered the ravens protected. Their wings were clipped to keep them from wandering too far, and the yeoman warders, the famous beefeaters of the tower, became their unlikely caretakers. From that moment on, the ravens were enshrined in folklore as avian sentinels of monarchy. To modern eyes, it might seem strange that a king so closely associated with science and rational curiosity, this is the same Charles who founded the Royal Society, would indulge in a superstition about birds. Yet it makes a certain kind of sense. Charles had lived through the trauma of exile, the execution of his father, and the chaos of civil war. For him, stability was precious, and symbols of stability mattered. If ravens reassured people that the kingdom was protected, then keeping them was less about belief than about optics. Monarchy, after all, thrives on theatre. And theatre it became. Over the centuries, the tower ravens became part of the tourist experience, part of the living mythology of monarchy. Visitors came to gawk at them, to hear the stories of their importance, to marvel at how seriously the superstition was treated. The birds themselves, being ravens, contributed to the legend with their uncanny intelligence, their loud caws, and their ominous presence. To stand in the tower and hear them cry is to feel, even now, the thin veil between history and myth. Of course, ravens are not immortal, nor are they always cooperative. Records tell of several occasions when the birds deserted their posts, usually wandering off into the streets of London. During the Second World War, the population dwindled to just a single raven, prompting Winston Churchill to insist on replenishing the flock for the sake of national morale. Today, the tower maintains at least 6 ravens at all times, each named and cared for as both mascots and symbols. The superstition endures not because people genuinely believe ravens hold the kingdom together, but because it dramatizes a deeper truth. Monarchy itself is sustained by myths, not realities. The birds are living metaphors for continuity, guardians of a fragile illusion that power and tradition are eternal. Whether they are perched on the battlements or scavenging scraps from tourists, they remind visitors that England's monarchy is as much about stories as it is about crowns and laws. The ravens also reveal the monarchy's knack for adapting old symbols to new circumstances. What began as a Restoration-era superstition has become a tourist attraction and cultural ritual. The legend has survived plagues, wars, and dynastic shifts because it entertains and reassures, much like Elizabeth's painted mask or Charles II's public pageantry. In the end, the tower ravens are not protectors of the crown so much as performers in its ongoing drama. And yet, while the ravens remind us of the theatrical side of monarchy, the next tale drags us back into its most unglamorous reality. For behind every royal throne, every gilded crown, and every pompous ceremony was a man whose job was as practical as it was absurd. The Groom of the Stool, the courtier tasked with attending to the king's bodily needs, who wielded more political influence than many generals or bishops. In the bizarre hierarchy of royal service, even the monarch's toilet became a throne of power. The power of the Groom of the Stool. If the ravens of the tower represented the monarchy's strange dependence on superstition, the story of the Groom of the Stool shows its dependence on something even stranger: intimacy. Few court offices seem more absurd to modern ears than this one, a position whose name alone provokes snickers. And yet, in the Tudor and early Stuart courts, the Groom of the Stool was one of the most powerful men in England. His influence came not from military command, not from titles or birth, but from attending to the king's most private and least glamorous needs. The office began in the late 15th century under Henry VII and blossomed under his son Henry VIII. The title stool referred to the monarch's portable toilet, a piece of furniture that travelled with him wherever he went. The Groom of the Stool was the man who managed this device, ensuring it was ready when required and maintaining the linens and cleanliness around the royal body. On the surface, it seems like a position of humiliation, a job no nobleman would want, but in practice, it became one of the most coveted posts at court. Why? Because proximity is power. The Groom of the Stool had access to the king at his most unguarded moments, in settings where few others were allowed. In the chamber where the monarch relieved himself, conversations could occur without courtiers, ambassadors, or spies present. The groom became not just a servant but a confidant, privy to secrets, petitions, and spontaneous decisions. In an age when royal favour determined everything from land grants to political survival, being close to the king in such an intimate way translated into extraordinary influence, Henry VIII's grooms of the stool, for instance, were not lowly attendants but high-ranking gentlemen, often elevated to knighthood and enriched with lands. The position allowed them to control access to the king, to filter requests, and to shape royal opinion. Historians have noted that the groom's control of paperwork, finances, and petitions duties that grew alongside his more personal ones meant he effectively acted as a private secretary. Some even wielded authority rivaling that of ministers. The paradox is striking. In public, the monarchy projected majesty, divine right, and inviolability. Yet, behind the curtains, a courtier literally served the king in his most vulnerable state. And instead of diminishing the role, this vulnerability magnified it. The groom of the stool was trusted because he had to be. No king would tolerate disloyalty in someone so close, and the very intimacy of the role demanded discretion. Of course, satire abounded. Enemies of the court mocked the absurdity of a nobleman gaining riches by such an undignified route. The very idea that power could flow from the privy seemed to confirm suspicions that the court was corrupt and ridiculous. But those who held the office knew better. They understood that in monarchy, appearances deceive. The glittering throne in the great hall might symbolize power, but the true decisions were often shaped in the quiet privacy of the chamber, where the groom and the king spoke without interruption. By the time of the later Stuarts and the Hanoverians, the role shifted, becoming less personal and more administrative. The groom of the stool turned into the groom of the stole, a position tied to wardrobe and finance rather than bodily functions. But the legend of the earlier role lingered, cementing the idea that the path to power in a monarchy could take the strangest of routes. The story of the groom of the stool underscores the contradictions of kingship. Monarchs are supposed to be distant, godlike figures, yet their humanity so carefully hidden behind ceremony must still be managed. That management, in turn, creates opportunities for influence. What looks humiliating from the outside becomes empowering on the inside. It is monarchy in microcosm, absurd, intimate, and never quite as dignified as it pretends to be. And if the groom of the stool shows how monarchy's power could flow from private chambers, the next tale shows how it could just as easily be compromised by forbidden desires. For George IV, the rotund, flamboyant, and perpetually indebted king, harboured a secret marriage to a Catholic woman that broke the laws of his own throne, an indiscretion that would haunt his reign and expose the monarchy's hypocrisy about love, law, and loyalty. George IV's secret marriage to Mrs. Fitzherbert, 1785. If the groom of the stool illustrated how royal dignity could be undone by the necessities of biology, George IV's secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert showed how it could be undone by desire. For in 1785, long before he became king, the future George IV, then Prince of Wales, entered into a union that violated both English law and the expectations of monarchy. It was a marriage forbidden, clandestine, and ultimately denied by history, yet it shadowed his entire reign. George was the eldest son of George III, a monarch known for his stubborn morality and commitment to duty. The prince, however, was his opposite in nearly every way: extravagant, impulsive, perpetually in debt, and prone to grand displays of romance. At the age of 23, he fell deeply in love with Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic gentlewoman, 6 years his senior. She was charming, pious, and independent-minded qualities that only intensified the attraction. But the match was impossible by law. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed largely to prevent George's siblings from marrying without the king's consent, required that any descendant of George II obtain the sovereign's approval for marriage. George III would never have consented to a union with a Catholic, as such a marriage was also forbidden by the Act of Settlement, The heir to the throne was not merely discouraged but legally barred from wedding a Catholic, lest it jeopardize the Protestant succession. Yet George was undeterred. In December 1785, he and Maria Fitzherbert were married in a private ceremony conducted by a clergyman who was sympathetic or perhaps simply reckless. The marriage was legally invalid under English law, but emotionally, George clung to it as binding. He addressed Maria as his wife, showered her with gifts, and kept her portrait close. In his private estimation, she was the great love of his life. The secrecy of the marriage was fragile. Rumours swirled in society, and pamphlets circulated about the prince's Catholic wife. Politicians worried about the implications. If the marriage were acknowledged, the prince might be disqualified from succession. Maria herself endured intense scrutiny, caught between devotion to George and the recognition that their union placed her in a precarious position. She could never be queen, but she could never be simply dismissed either. The scandal shaped George's political life. When, years later, he sought financial relief from Parliament to cover his enormous debts, his opponents used the Fitzherbert marriage as leverage, questioning his judgment and morality. To secure funds, George distanced himself publicly from Maria, even while privately insisting on the bond. Their relationship waxed and waned over the years, marked by reconciliations and separations, but the shadow of that 1785 ceremony never faded. The irony of George's secret marriage is that it revealed the monarchy's hypocrisy. Kings and princes could indulge in mistresses openly. Charles II had made a career of it, but a marriage, especially one to a Catholic, was intolerable because it threatened the fragile architecture of law and succession. George could gamble away fortunes, live in debt, and behave with extravagance, but the thing that most endangered him was an act of love performed in defiance of statute. When George IV finally became king in 1820, Maria Fitzherbert was long estranged from him, replaced by a parade of other attachments and scandals. Yet on his deathbed in 1830, George reportedly declared that Maria had been his true wife, the only woman he had ever loved. He kept her portrait near him, even as official history erased their marriage from recognition. Thus, the secret union stands as one of the strangest contradictions of monarchy. A marriage both real and unreal, binding in the heart, but void in the law. A love story that could never be fully acknowledged because it collided with the machinery of power. And if George's secret marriage exposed the monarchy's hypocrisy in private life, his next great scandal would expose it in public life. The Queen Caroline Affair, 1820-21. By the time George IV ascended the throne in 1820, his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert was long behind him. But his marital woes were far from over. Now the scandal was not hidden in private chapels, but played out in full view of the nation, with his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, cast as the heroine or villainess, depending on one's perspective, of one of the most sensational public dramas in royal history. George had married Caroline in 1795 under pressure from his father and Parliament. The match was arranged to secure the succession and settle his spiralling debts. From the beginning, it was a disaster. George found Caroline coarse and unappealing, famously declaring on their wedding night that he was repulsed by her. She, in turn, regarded him as bloated, drunken, and arrogant. Within a year, their only child, Princess Charlotte, was born, and the couple separated almost immediately. For the next 2 decades, George lived openly with mistresses, while Caroline travelled abroad, gathering a reputation for eccentricity and scandal. Rumours swirled of her affairs, her unconventional household on the continent, and her defiance of expectations. Yet when George became king in 1820, Caroline returned to Britain to claim her place as queen consort. George, horrified, resolved to prevent her recognition. What followed was a public spectacle unlike anything England had seen before. Parliament introduced the Pains and Penalties Bill, a piece of legislation designed to annul the marriage and strip Caroline of her title. Witnesses were called to testify about her alleged misconduct abroad, including supposed affairs with servants. The trial became a media frenzy, with pamphlets, cartoons, and broadsheets fanning the flames of public opinion. To George's dismay, much of the nation rallied behind Caroline. The public saw her as the wronged wife, humiliated by a hypocritical king who paraded his own vices while attempting to destroy hers. Crowds gathered outside Parliament chanting her name, and satirical prints mocked George as a corpulent tyrant. The more George pushed, the more sympathetic Caroline appeared. In the end, the bill failed to pass. Caroline remained legally queen consort, though she was barred from George's coronation in 1821, a final humiliation staged with deliberate cruelty. She died shortly thereafter, worn down by stress and illness, but not before carving her place in history as the woman who defied a king in front of his people and forced the monarchy into one of its most public embarrassments. The Queen Caroline affair was more than a marital spat. It exposed the monarchy's fragility in an age of growing public opinion. Newspapers and caricaturists turned the royal household into a soap opera, and the king found himself outmaneuvered by popular sympathy for his despised wife. For George, who craved respect and deference, it was a humiliation that no parade of velvet robes could conceal. And yet, in the way of all royal scandals, the affair was absorbed into the long list of bizarre contradictions that define monarchy. A king who could not love his wife, a queen who could not be crowned, and a public who delighted in the chaos it was Shakespearean farce played out in real time. If George IV's reign was riddled with humiliation, the reign of his father's rival Charles I had ended with something starker: execution. Yet even in his final moments, Charles found a way to turn death into performance, donning 2 shirts on the scaffold so that the crowd would not mistake a shiver for fear. In monarchy, even dying required stagecraft. Charles I wore 2 shirts to his execution, 1649. If George IV's humiliation came from scandalous wives and secret marriages, Charles I's humiliation came from something far worse: the scaffold. His reign had unravelled into the calamity of civil war, and unlike his son Charles II, he would not live to see a restoration. Instead, in January 1649, Charles I became the first English king to be tried and executed by his own subjects. Yet even in the shadow of death, Charles managed to remind everyone that monarchy was performance. His choice? To wear 2 shirts. The Civil War had pitted king against parliament, absolutism against constitutional experiment. Charles, convinced of his divine right, clashed with a growing movement that insisted no monarch could rule without consent. His stubbornness, his unpopular taxes, his favoritism toward certain advisors, and his religious policies all contributed to years of bloodshed. By 1649, defeated and imprisoned, he faced trial for treason. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Charles was sentenced to death. On the morning of the 30th of January, Charles prepared for his final appearance. He dressed with care, as though preparing for a royal pageant rather than an execution. But he made one notable adjustment. He donned 2 shirts. The reason, he explained, was practical but symbolic. It was bitterly cold that day, and he feared that if he shivered on the scaffold, the watching crowd might mistake it for fear. Better to be warm and still, so that his composure would not be questioned. It was a masterstroke of image management. Even as he lost his crown, Charles refused to surrender dignity. He spoke calmly to those assembled. reaffirming his belief that kings were accountable only to God, not to men. His words were measured, his posture resolute. And when the moment came, he laid his head on the block with a serenity that impressed even some of his enemies. The executioner's axe fell, severing the king's head from his body, and with it severing the idea that monarchy was unassailable. Yet what endured was not just the act, but the performance. The two shirts became a symbol of Charles's awareness that even in death, he was being watched, judged, remembered. Monarchy was theatre, and his final costume choice proved it. He could not control the verdict, but he could control the optics. In the decades that followed, royalists turned Charles into a martyr, a saintly figure who had died for principle. The story of his two shirts fit neatly into that narrative, a detail that reinforced his calm, his dignity, his transcendence above mortal fear. Parliamentarians, of course, told the story differently, mocking him as stubborn to the end. But both sides agreed Charles had managed to stage his own death with care. The irony, of course, is that the careful staging of his final act could not prevent the monarchy's collapse. For 11 years, England existed without a king, ruled first as a republic and then under Cromwell's protectorate. And yet, when Charles II returned in 1660, the monarchy revived, the martyrdom of Charles I lending a new aura to the crown. His two shirts had become part of the mythology of monarchy, proof that even in defeat, kings could turn weakness into theatre. If Charles's death reminds us of monarchy's fragility, the next tale reminds us of monarchy's resilience, not in the form of execution, but of escape. For years before Charles lost his head, another royal, Empress Matilda, had faced defeat and entrapment. And in 1142, she escaped to cross a frozen river cloaked in white, vanishing into legend like a ghost slipping through snow. Empress Matilda's snow-white escape, 1142. If Charles I's final act on the scaffold was about composure in death, Empress Matilda's escape from Oxford Castle in the winter of 1142 was about composure in life, or more precisely, in near death. For her dramatic flight across the frozen Thames remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the medieval monarchy, a moment when the fate of a dynasty seemed to hinge on one woman's ability to outwit both her enemies and the weather. Matilda, daughter of Henry I, was the designated heir to the English throne after her brother William Adelin's death in the White Ship disaster. But upon Henry's death in 1135, her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the crown, plunging the kingdom into nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda, supported by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester and other loyalists, fought fiercely to assert her claim. The war seesawed between victories and defeats, each side capturing and releasing the other's leaders in a cycle of chaos. By late 1142, Matilda was besieged in Oxford Castle by Stephen's forces. Winter closed in, supplies dwindled, and her situation grew desperate. Surrender seemed inevitable. But then came the escape that would define her legend. According to chroniclers, Matilda and a small group of companions donned white cloaks to blend with the snow. Under cover of night, they slipped out of the castle, crossing the frozen Thames in silence. The whiteness of their garments made them almost invisible against the snow, and the icy river bore their weight as they crept across. Behind them, Stephen's army kept watch, but the darkness and the snow concealed the fugitives. By dawn, Matilda had reached the safety of Wallingford, where her allies sheltered her. The imagery is irresistible. The Empress, rightful heir to the throne, gliding across a frozen river like a ghost, defying capture by stealth and winter itself. Chroniclers likened it to divine intervention, proof that God protected her cause. To her enemies, it was an embarrassment. To her supporters, it was a miracle. To modern readers, it remains one of the most cinematic moments of medieval history, blending danger, cunning, and sheer luck. Matilda's escape did not win her the crown, but it prolonged the struggle. The war dragged on, devastating the land and exhausting both factions. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king, but upon his death, the throne would pass to Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou. In 1154, that son became Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings. Thus, Matilda's snowy flight preserved the dynasty even if she herself never wore the crown. The irony of her story lies in its duality. She was denied her rightful inheritance because she was a woman in a world unwilling to accept female rule, yet her survival ensured the continuation of her bloodline, shaping English history for centuries. Her escape, in other words, was not just about one night in the snow, it was about preserving a dynasty that would dominate England and France for generations. It is tempting to imagine the silence of that night, the crunch of snow beneath boots, the frozen air burning in her lungs, the weight of destiny pressing down with every step. History rarely pauses for moments of suspense, but in that crossing of the Thames, it did. Matilda's survival was England's turning point wrapped in frost. And if Matilda's tragedy was that she never produced a living heir to take her throne in her own lifetime, the tragedy of another queen, centuries later, was that she produced too many children, 17 pregnancies, yet not a single surviving heir. Queen Anne's womb became her battlefield, and the end of the Stuart line was written not in snow, but in sorrow. Queen Anne's tragic record of 17 pregnancies. If Empress Matilda's frozen escape preserved a dynasty that she herself never lived to rule, Queen Anne's tragedy was the opposite. Her body was the battlefield, her womb the stage, and it lost the war for her. Anne reigned from 1702 to 1714, the last of the Stuart monarchs, and while her reign saw political achievements of great importance, the Acts of Union creating Great Britain, victories in the War of the Spanish Succession, her personal story is dominated by a sorrow both intimate and national. For Anne endured 17 pregnancies, yet not one child survived to inherit the throne. The numbers are stark. 17 times Anne conceived. 12 of those ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. Of the 5 children born alive, none survived to adulthood. Her longest-lived child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, reached the age of 11 before dying suddenly of what was likely hydrocephalus. His death in 1700 extinguished the last hope of a direct Stuart heir. The nation, already divided over religion and succession, now faced the terrifying prospect of a throne without a clear future. For Anne, the grief must have been unimaginable. Each pregnancy brought hope, each loss devastation. Letters from the period hint at her sorrow, but also at the relentless pressure placed upon her. Queens were not merely wives or rulers. They were dynastic vessels. Their worth, in the eyes of their courts, was measured in heirs. To fail again and again was not only a personal heartbreak, but a political disaster. Anne's health deteriorated over the years, her body ravaged by repeated pregnancies, by gout, and by autoimmune conditions that left her in constant pain. She grew increasingly reclusive, her world shrinking even as her political responsibilities expanded. Portraits from her later years show a woman swollen with illness, her body betraying her while her crown demanded endurance. The absence of heirs forced Parliament to intervene. In 1701, before Anne even became queen, the Act of Settlement declared that if she died without surviving issue, the throne would pass to the Protestant descendants of Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of James I. It was a brutal reminder of how little control Anne had over her legacy. Her body had failed to secure the dynasty, and so Parliament rewrote history around her, casting the Stuarts aside in favour of the Hanoverians. And so it happened. When Anne died in 1714, exhausted and broken, the crown passed not to a Stuart, but to George I of Hanover. With Anne, the line that had ruled since James I came from Scotland in 1603 ended forever. Her tragedies were not merely personal, they were national, shaping the entire trajectory of British monarchy for centuries to come. Anne's story underscores the cruel paradox of queenship. She was intelligent, pious, and determined, but none of that mattered against the brutal arithmetic of her pregnancies. History remembers her less for her governance than for her childlessness, as though her worth as queen were measured only in sons. In this way, she became both victim and symbol, the woman who bore the hopes of a dynasty, but buried them all before they could live. If Anne's sorrow was written in miscarriages and stillbirths, another royal story was written in deliberate separation, not of womb and child, but of heart and body. Richard I, the Lionheart, after his death in 1199, had his heart embalmed separately and buried at Rouen, far from the rest of him. Where Anne's body failed to produce heirs, Richard's body was fractured deliberately, scattered as though even in death he had to belong to many places at once. Richard I, the Lionheart, a heart divided. Richard I, remembered as the crusading Lionheart, died in 1199 after being struck by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France. His death, like his life, was both glorious and absurd. A king who had fought across Europe and the Middle East, felled by a peasant's arrow while besieging a castle of little importance. Yet it was not just his manner of death that fascinated contemporaries, it was what happened afterward. His body was divided, embalmed, and buried in pieces. Richard's body was interred at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, alongside his father, Henry II. His entrails were buried at the site of his death in Chaluz, while his heart was taken to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and entombed there. The symbolism was deliberate. Richard had spent most of his life not in England but in his French domains, and his heart, quite literally, was placed in Normandy, the land he loved most fiercely. The embalming of his heart was not merely symbolic but ritualistic. In 2013, scientists analysed the remains of the heart and discovered that it had been preserved with a mixture of herbs, spices, and resins, including frankincense, myrtle, and lime. The choice of ingredients suggests that Richard's heart was treated almost as a relic, preserved with materials associated with sanctity and reverence. For his contemporaries, the separation of his body symbolized the vastness of his rule and the multiplicity of his loyalties. But the division of his body also underscored the contradictions of his reign. Richard is remembered in England as a national hero, yet he spent less than a year of his 10-year reign in the country. He drained its coffers to fund his crusades, treated it as a source of revenue rather than a home, and left its governance largely to others. His heart in Rouen was an acknowledgement of the truth. His affections lay in Normandy, not England. To his supporters, the scattering of his remains made him larger than life, a king who could not be confined to one grave. To his critics, it was proof of his divided loyalties, a monarch whose body was as fractured as his reign. To modernize, it is a reminder of how monarchy turns even death into symbolism. Ordinary men are buried whole. Kings are dissected into allegories. Richard's heart, lying beneath Rouen Cathedral, became an object of both reverence and irony. Reverence, because it suggested that the king's valour still pulsed in the soil of Normandy. Irony, because the heart that should have belonged to England was preserved elsewhere, a final betrayal by a king more crusader than sovereign. If Richard's death scattered his body in sanctified fragments, another story would scatter the dignity of monarchy in a very different way. not in relics or relic worship, but in a scandal over cards. For in 1890, the royal baccarat scandal erupted, dragging the future Edward VII into court and exposing just how easily the veneer of majesty could be stained by something as trivial as a game of chance. The Royal Baccarat Scandal, 1890. If Richard the Lionheart's embalmed heart reminds us of how royals could be elevated into relics, the Royal Baccarat Scandal of 1890 reminds us of how royals could be dragged down into ridicule by something as ordinary as cards. It was a scandal born not of war, religion, or succession, but of leisure, a glimpse into the private lives of the powerful that revealed just how fragile their dignity could be. The central figure was the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, already known for his love of gambling, society parties, and indulgence. In September 1890, he attended a house party at Tranby Croft, the country home of Arthur Wilson, a wealthy shipping magnate. Among the entertainments was a game of baccarat, a fashionable card game at the time. During the game, one of the players, Sir William Gordon Cumming, was accused of cheating. Several guests claimed to have witnessed him improperly increasing his bets. The matter might have ended discreetly, but Gordon Cumming, outraged by the accusation, demanded satisfaction. The affair escalated until it reached the courts, with a libel suit that drew national attention. The trial that followed became one of the great sensations of Victorian England. The Prince of Wales himself was called to testify, the first time an heir to the throne had appeared in court since the Middle Ages. The spectacle was unprecedented. Newspapers swarmed with coverage, caricaturists had a field day, and the public watched with fascination as the private amusements of the elite became the stuff of public scandal. Gordon Cumming lost the case, his reputation ruined, but the monarchy did not emerge unscathed. Edward's presence at the gaming table, his willingness to indulge in leisure with wealthy commoners, and his entanglement in a sordid dispute over cheating painted him as frivolous, irresponsible, and unfit for the seriousness of kingship. Though he would later reign with surprising competence, the baccarat scandal cemented his reputation as a playboy prince, more interested in pleasure than duty. The scandal also underscored the precariousness of monarchy in an age of mass media. Victorian England was not the medieval world. Newspapers and tabloids amplified every detail, turning private indiscretions into national debates. If Elizabeth I's lead base cosmetics had been a secret slow poison, Edward's baccarat scandal was a public spectacle, poisoning the monarchy's image in real time. In the end, the scandal revealed how easily majesty could be toppled not by rebellion, not by molehills or lampreys, but by cards on a table. Monarchy thrives on illusion, but sometimes the curtain slips, and what is revealed is not the grandeur of sovereignty, but the petty frailties of human behaviour. And perhaps that is the thread that ties all these stories together. From Anne's barren womb to Richard's divided body to Edward's disgraced card table, monarchy is forever caught between image and reality, dignity and absurdity. The crown is supposed to embody permanence, but the stories we remember are the ones that reveal its fragility.